So it's telling me now the webinar is now streaming live on YouTube. So John, let's get going. John Waters is an Irish writer and commentator, the author of 10 books and a playwright. Oh, geez. Hold on a second. It's talking back to me now. All right, sorry. I had the YouTube sound on. I'm getting rusty here. So I'll start again. John Waters is an Irish writer and commentator, the author of 10 books and a playwright. What this job description fails to mention is John's experience as a songwriter. So we'll talk a bit about that this afternoon. It also doesn't mention the activism in which John is engaged at the moment and which has given him plenty to be doing since he left his career in Irish journalism 5 years ago. A painful end to a 30-year stint in the thick of mainstream discussion in Irish life. So John, thank you for joining me today. I very much appreciate it.
Pleasure, Fergus. How are you doing?
I'm good, thanks. Yeah. So just briefly, do you mind going back to the election? Because the last time we spoke in an interview, it was before you did that. And I just want to ask you, how do you feel about that whole experience? I know things have changed so much since then, but how do you view all that?
Yeah, it seems like a different century as opposed to the same year. Mm. And yeah, I mean, it was a strange thing. It was kind of something I was talking to doing somewhat against my better judgment because I have a view that the political system in Ireland is all kind of rigged and fixed. And it's pure folly to be trying to break into it unless you actually know where all the landmines are. But I felt that symbolically there was a necessity to, I was convinced that it would be an important thing to do. I kind of still feel that a little bit, although, I got less than 1,000 votes, which, isn't great. Although in the constituency I was running in Journaliars, which is where I live, I have been living for 30 years, which is kind of probably the most, what I would call batshit crazy constituency in Ireland in terms of, what is called liberalism, but isn't really. Getting 1,000 votes, as somebody pointed out, that's a village, that's a village, and that's all right. So there's like nearly 1,000 people out there who kind of think of me as a mildly good idea, I suppose. Yeah. But I haven't really settled on my view because I think that my view is that Irish politics, and this has been, in a sense, this view has been furthered and to some extent vindicated already by the events since then. Irish politics is basically in the exit chamber insofar as democracy is concerned. And the question is, are we going to reclaim our democracy or are we going to move on to the next phase, which is, nothing progressive at all, nothing liberal at all, but a form of totalitarianism. We're almost there now as a result of the past 7 months of post-lockdown events. And so I'm not really that clear as to where exactly we are in that kind of process. But certainly looking at the entrails of the election, where you had essentially no result, nobody won. Correct. And yet at the end, we got a government which nobody elected after something like 4 months. They cobbled together this thing in comprising two parties that had absolutely, tanked the country about a decade ago. And the other one which had just misruled it for the past, 8 years. And they all gang together and they continued the kind of totalitarian experiment that had been started in March. And so here we are. So, I hope I don't really have to run another election.
Yes.
I didn't enjoy it. And I didn't canvass a huge amount because I had been ill and I wasn't fit for it. But my wife was out quite a lot on my behalf, and she got a lot of abuse from people.
Really?
Yeah. It's an extraordinary thing about Ireland now that, and I get abuse. I'll talk to you later about the kind of abuse I've been getting recently. But it seems now that this is a symptom of a highly propagandized culture where people actually feel they have been so convinced by the lies about you that they feel that you are their personal enemy almost. And that, absolutely not. I mean, some of the insults can be quite creative, but
it's a struggle that they take on. They take this upon themselves to do right and to to take a lump out of John Waters. It's like they're doing their duty.
Well, I want to come back to that when we start to talk about the lockdown, because it's a very particular element of that I've noticed. But in general, yeah, there's something. Now, this is very interesting because I said I ran in Dunleary, which is in Dublin, right? Now, Dunleary is, I said, the epicenter of this kind of stuff in Ireland and in Dublin. And actually, you don't really encounter it outside Dublin so much. You might occasionally in Galway, maybe, which is a terrible pity because Galway used to be a beautiful city, or maybe in Cork a little bit, not so much maybe. And so it's something that happens here. And that's telling you that, you see, this is a bit complicated, but essentially what's happened to the world in real terms is that it's divided now very cleanly between two kinds of people. It's not an ideological divide as such. It's not left and right. It's not progressive versus conservative. It's not, good versus evil necessarily. It's not, any of those dualisms. Mm-hmm. What it is actually about what people work at. And I call it the concrete versus the virtual worlds. So, I mean, if I've been involved in anything in a high profile way, and I'm walking along the street and I see a guy coming towards me with a wrench or a hammer sticking out of his pocket, mm-hmm. I know he's not going to shout abuse at me.
Yes.
Right? But if he's dressed in lycra and riding a sports bike, there's about a 90% chance he's going to let fly with some stream of expletives, It's as simple as that, Fergus. Really, I can break the world down that simply. And the reason is basically, I actually misstated the situation. It's not so much the concrete versus the virtual. It's actually producers versus parasites. That you have an economy which is basically comprising two parts. And there's a war between these because the producers are the real economy. They're the people who actually make and mend the world, yes. Who paint the world, who clean the world every day, right? And they're the people with the hammers and the paintbrushes and the wrenches, and they're absolutely cool with everything I do. Insofar as they care about what they,
exactly.
And they may not even care. They may not even know who I am. Lots of times they don't, and I don't mind that in the slightest. Believe me. The other guys all know who I am, and they are actually. They're extraordinarily nasty people. And the reason is that they are jealous of the producers because all they do, they work in tippy-tappy jobs, They are tippy-tappy people as opposed to singing. What was that song by, what was it? I forget now. Something tappy people.
Smiley happy people. R.E.M., right? Yeah. R.E.M. song, yeah.
And so, you see, this is the fundamental divide of the world now, and it defines the divide over the Trump divide. That's what it's about. Trump discovered the producers. He discovered the concrete classes.
Well, you would say he knew them, and he understood how to contact them or connect with them.
He absolutely did, because he's a builder.
Yeah.
He never dirtied his hands himself. But when he arrived on the site, I mean, if you hear people talking who work for him on the as when he was building his hotels and buildings in New York, when he arrived on the site, he always went down into the foundational trench or up to the crane driver or talking to the plasterers or the block layers. And, they really got on well with him. He had an empathy with them. And he actually translated that connection into a program for becoming president of the United States. He recognized those people on the universal scale in America. Mm-hmm. And spoke to them, and they heard him. And that's kind of fundamentally what that's about. And Brexit is about essentially the same thing, and so are the yellow vests in France. And you see this now right across Europe. There's a wave, which to a high degree I think depends on Donald Trump being re-elected, mm-hmm. because it's kind of lost its footing to some extent as a result of the so-called pandemic.
Yes.
And it has become unseated to some extent. But I think Trump's election, which is almost certain now, re-election will reboot all of that again.
So you think he's going to win it hands down? Like you're that confident?
Oh yeah. Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Why are you so sure?
Because, well, I knew he was going to win the first time, and everybody else thought he wasn't. So I'm telling you now, he's going to win again, and pretty much everybody else isn't sure. I can't for the life of me imagine that Joe Biden is going to win to become president of the United States. I mean, that would be an insane thing for the American people to do, and they're not insane in general. There are a lot of them insane actually, but not enough. You know.
Yeah, I know what you mean. But the thing is, in order to view the two candidates, you need to be exposed to the two of them, and Trump is getting all the media attention, rightly or wrongly, good or bad, you know. So I don't even think that Biden is getting scrutiny in the way that might weaken him or show his frailties or whatever. Do you know what I mean? Because the people who might consider voting for him aren't seeing the other view. You know, it's you really pick your poison here, and it is, I would actually say, just as bad on the other side. Like I'll give you an example. On YouTube, there was this Sean Hannity fella.
Yeah.
And it's Hannity, Trump steamrolls Biden in first debate. And everyone I spoke to, and a lot of people, I'm in Alabama, right? These are not people up in New York and Connecticut and Boston, right? And a lot of people did say Trump was jumping in there and being obnoxious, and it was embarrassing for all involved, you know? And maybe that was Trump's tactic. Do you know what? But the point being, Biden and Trump are not both on this platform being equally scrutinized in front of all voters, so that
that's right, Fergus. That's right. But there's an important thing you got to remember, that you're probably seeing this to some extent through the optic of the media.
Correct.
The mainstream media, and I mean, they're actually quite relatively marginal now. You know, they don't know it yet. But I mean, virtually, I mean, their readerships and their viewerships have been plummeting for the last 10 years. Mm-hmm. And that's the same is true everywhere in terms of certainly print newspapers. And also, I think in America, channel television, what do you call it, TV, cable TV, that's kind of gone or almost gone. And now you've got all kinds of splintering happening. Yes. And more, you know, the internet is the place where the connectivity happens. And that's kind of a territory that Trump conquered, 5 years ago. And he's very good at it. And you see, the debate, I didn't see it all, but I saw portions of it. And my general sense of it is that it was a nothing, you know, it really didn't amount to anything. That nobody won, nobody lost, nobody gained a single vote. Exactly. I didn't think, because it was just a slanging match, and you know it wasn't. You see, the big problem Trump had in terms of doing debates like that is that whereas in 2016 he was the outsider on the white charger coming in to drain the swamp and clean up Washington D.C. and he's not anymore. He's now the incumbent president. So that ticket is gone.
Yes.
And so he can't really attack Biden in the same way. Biden, for some reason, and it's partly because of his frailty, which I'm very sympathetic to, by the way, at a personal level. I feel for the man as a person. You know, I don't think he's up to being in the race. You know, and I do wish him well as a person, because, you know, I think, you know, I mean, we could argue about politics, but, you know, I don't like to see somebody being put in front of a moving train like that, because Trump is a moving train and moving very fast. You know, yes. He's the Godzilla of world politics, you know, and I wouldn't like to be in his path if he wanted to get past me, you know. So, so I do feel that a little bit. And I wonder if that won't be a factor to some extent, that people will feel Trump would need to pull back. Now, but the thing that strikes me is that about Trump, that he hasn't yet realized that it's a different kind of game to the last one in terms of these encounters, because that was one of the things he did really successfully last time, was the debates with Hillary. He was powerful, you know, particularly in the last two. And I don't know, I mean, he can always make a comeback. I mean, Trump is kind of formidable force, you know, he is like an unstoppable force in many respects. But as I say, that can work against him with Biden, because Biden is clearly unwell in some way. He's like, and people tend to think of him as like their grandfather, like, and they would hate to see their grandfather in that situation. And that sympathy vote could be more than you might imagine, you know. I don't know, but on the absolute, you know, on the facts as we see them, what's happened in America in the last year, the Black Lives Matter thing, the virus, the crushing of the economy, the collapse of the economy, which Trump, almost weeps when he speaks of, and understandably to a point, because on paper it was a very solid achievement. But I do think that he's got something like a month to go, a little bit over a month to go, and I think he can only lose it.
Yes.
But the thing about Trump is that the normal rules that apply to politicians, which is that they've got to avoid certain scandals or certain controversies, that doesn't seem to apply to Trump. He's got a kind of immunity.
Yeah.
There's almost nothing you could find out about Trump now, short of him having assassinated JFK or something like that, that would damage his reputation.
No, I know what you mean. They've thrown, there's nothing to hide anymore, kind of thing. Yeah.
No. You see, Fergus, I am of the view, you see, that Trump is a very clever individual. And I have been for a long time, that that a lot of even his tantrums are staged, that he's a very cunning individual in the way that he plays it. He doesn't make mistakes, really. He appears to make mistakes, but they always seem to rebound in his favor. And that seems to me that he understands things at an entirely different level.
Yes.
In terms of the public's understanding, or at least his public's understanding. Going back to this thing I talked about, the concrete producing classes, that they have a sense of grievance now, and a legitimate sense of grievance about the way that they've been treated by the Democratic Party, which used to be their party in the main, but they have been abandoned by it. And they've been abandoned by all the kind of, cultural icons. If you think of somebody like Bruce Springsteen, and you actually go into any one of Bruce Springsteen's songs, the characters at the center of those songs, once you know about their life, they are people who would, if they existed, be Trump voters,
I guess,
without a doubt, every single one of them. And yet Springsteen himself is out dissing Trump as often as he can, as is De Niro and all these other icons.
It's a feature Thomas Sheridan picks up on when he talks about, in the Irish example, the troubadours, like, that word is gas when he uses it, but the likes of Christy Moore and Glenn Hansard. Yes. Would you say there's a similar phenomenon going on there, maybe?
Definitely, yes. The establishment troubadours. Yeah, I agree with Thomas about that. Yes, it's like that. There is a thing, whereby what it actually is the politics of the 1960s, which have been put in a deep freeze at the very heart of the person. Maybe I don't know where that would be, but they've, instead of actually allowing them to taking their politics out and letting them open them up to the air and to reality, they have hidden them away and maintained them in a deep freeze. So they actually still think the year is 1968 in many ways, and they have no idea of any of the stuff that's happened or what the meaning of it is. I meet some of these people all the time, and it's quite extraordinary to talk to them.
You mean like the classical lefties from the 60s? Is that kind of what you mean?
Yeah, that's right. Which I would have been kind of among them, not in the 60s, but in the 70s and 80s, because I was somewhat younger than the first boomers, as it were. But that would have been my immediate instinct, because we came out of a place that was kind of grey and dark and kind of monochrome, say. And then a lot of exciting things happened in the 60s, 70s, and that attracted us and obviously invigorated us, and we were part of it. But I now kind of look at those people and realize that whereas they were moving then with the times, that they have stopped. I mean, they should have listened more carefully to Dylan, when that song, the times they are a-changing, they didn't stop changing in 1969, you see? And these people act as if they had. And that's their whole, their whole agenda is based on a notion of racism from the American politics of the 1960s and Martin Luther King and all that kind of stuff. But in fact, that has now been hijacked, appropriated, and leveraged by the corporate sector, the American corporate sector, who are now able to manipulate, and big tech and all these propaganda machines, which is able to manipulate the youth of all these countries, and indeed not so young, into having a particular view of reality, which actually happens to suit the corporations.
Exactly.
And these people can't see it.
The irony is that they are the elites who are taking advantage of the opportunity to side with the forgotten. but they're really winning by doing that. Do you know what I mean? They're
at the moment they're winning, Fergus. I agree, but I mean that's the thing about the Democratic Party of the United States. It's very interesting, like, and Biden is very much this. You know, if he were in the whole of his health and at the prime of his life, he would be very much this. That it now represents two constituencies. One is, as you say, the elite, and it's that kind of the elite in the major sense, the billionaire classes, but also those kind of, you know, tippy-tappy guys, you know, the kind of parasitical classes. And then at the other side of the sandwich is a kind of a hijacked constituency of minorities.
Yes.
That they've adopted and leveraged and weaponized actually as their entire entire kind of armory of policies and politics. And they're using this to kind of bludgeon their way and acquire a kind of monopoly of American politics. Because if they can, for example, bring in enough illegal immigrants and give them votes, then the Democratic Party will be in office forever.
I will point out that people do point out, and I'll repeat it, that it's not like the Republicans have been doing their best to get on the side of these people either. You know, so I think there is a certain maybe cynical attempt to side with these people for political reasons, right? Yeah. But at the same time, these people do wonder, well, where were the Republicans for the last 2 decades?
Well, that's very true. I mean, you know, what actually happened was that the Republicans followed the Democrats, but were less effective at doing what the Democrats were doing. A lot of those kind of those kind of Paul Ryan and what do you call that guy who ran for the president last time? You know,
Romney,
Romney, yeah, they're all like doing that kind of thing. Like that's their market because they are kind of elitist people themselves. But you see, that's where Trump came in, and this Trump is completely counterintuitive because if you had looked at his CV before and his profile before, you would have said, well, he's definitely one of the elite, and yes, of course, in every sense he is, except that he actually understands the problem, or appears to. You know, I mean, and he has shown given a lot of evidence that he does understand the problem because he's repatriated lots of industries and all of that sort of, and he's created huge employment for people, including in the Black community and the Latino community, and that is now showing up in huge support for him in those communities, which was previously undreamt of.
Exactly.
So you know, he is this strange anomaly, and I mean, you know, I have a strange attitude to Trump. I've never met him, of course, but I guess, you know, my personality is such that if I were to be in a room with Trump, I probably wouldn't be his best pal. I mean, there's no way we would ever be best pals. In fact, I doubt if we might have a laugh for about 3 minutes and then that'd be it, or something like that, you know. I couldn't imagine myself working for him because I don't think I'd last. But I like the idea of him politically.
I get you. And what he is representing, or who he is representing.
And the people he is representing, because they are the blue-collar workers who are abandoned by the Democratic Party in pursuit of cultural Marxism, essentially. That's, in a nutshell, what happened.
I want to bring us back now to Europe, if you don't mind. And this is, again, we'll bring it up to the present day, right? You wrote a song that called They Can't Stop the Spring. And I'm going to just read a couple of verses here, because I don't think a lot of people know. They might know, oh, John Waters is in the Eurovision, but I don't know how many people, or how present that is in people's memories. Maybe I just don't remember the.
Well, I think I got enough of a slagging for it.
Yeah, but let's go back to the words, right? The curtain has been raised, the wall no longer stands, and from Lissadell to Latvia, we're singing as one clan. The curtain has been raised, and Europe's all one stage, and the archipelagic icicles have melted like the cage. We don't need no party, just a party band, a continental choir singing hand in hand. They might scare the blackbird, but they cannot stop him sing. They may steal the honey, but they'll never steal the sting. They may crush the flowers, trample every living thing, but they can't stop the spring. So, 2 things I want to ask you. And the first is, it sounds like in that song, it just sounds on the face of it, maybe you can tell me something else, but it sounds like you are embracing some sort of European project on the surface, which maybe now you might be second guessing. But then secondly, generally speaking, I want to know what were you writing about with that song? What were you trying to articulate or explore or express or whatever?
Well, the title, They Can't Stop the Spring, actually comes from Alexander Dubček, the Czech prime minister at the time of the Prague Spring in 1968. And it came about, and the line is stolen actually, and I remember the moment who he stole it from, but nevertheless, he used it, and it became famous through him. I remember when the revolution, and he announced, he basically was the Gorbachev of Czechoslovakia long before his time, and he tried to introduce, socialism with a human face and all that, so there was a kind of a revolutionary spirit, and the students were on the streets demonstrating, and he was disposed towards giving in, and he was summoned to Moscow and humiliated there. And the tanks arrived in Prague, and they rolled down the Wenceslas Square, and the students, as they passed, were throwing flowers in front of the tanks as they passed. And Dubček said this: they may crush the flowers, but they cannot stop the spring. And so that's kind of the foundation of the song. Now, no, the song is not about any kind of project. I don't believe in those kind of projects at all. And I mean, those kind of projects were precisely the problem in Czechoslovakia. What I was talking about was something different, because you see, this is quite complicated in a way, because people actually force you into an either-or situation. They say, well, are you Irish or are you European? And I say, I'm both. Is that all right? I've always been European. I've always felt European. I mean, I feel connected to Dostoevsky and Kafka and all those people, those great writers. So what I'm talking about there is a cultural entity of Europe. Which is a civilization, which is, if you like, it's based on, it started with Christianity. Christianity is the heart of it. And that is what Europe is, and always was, and always will be, if it is allowed to survive. And so I'm not talking about a project that has been basically tried to...
The stars in the circle, yeah.
Oh, yeah, I mean, it's essentially trying to put a square hole in or a round peg. It's completely, even if it were more culturally oriented, which it isn't at all, I think it would be possibly unworkable, because the cultures of Europe depend on their diversity and their particularity. So it is in the interrelationships between the different cultures that the great vibrancy of Europe happens. That's not possible really to politicize, to unify in those kind of terms. It's not like America. Europe can never be like America, where there's this common language and a common sort of history and tradition, albeit a short one. And so that's kind of what the song was about. I mean, it's Eurovision. I mean, the strange thing about that song was people don't really understand, nor most people don't really care, but just for what it's worth. I mean, there's the band that sang that song in Eurovision were Dervish, a traditional band from Sligo. And they actually have been chosen by the national broadcaster, RTE, to actually represent Ireland that year. And the protocol went out to songwriters asking, could they write a song which required to be two things: a song that Dervish could sing as a traditional band, and a song that would be suited to Eurovision. And we had the good luck or the misfortune to win at the Irish level. We entered this song, and we went into the competition. We had no idea. Once we were in, we had no control over anything that happened, over the arrangement, the choreography, anything. You forget the
dancing is kind of funny. It looks a bit, I don't know, cobbled together. They're either jumping around the place.
Well, yeah, it isn't really. It isn't really. I mean, but we didn't have any say in anything.
No,
I mean, they're a traditional band. They were used to be, and it was artificial for them as well.
Exactly.
And but the thing about it is that, like, we came last. Let's be frank, and that's not the first or last time that Ireland came last. But but this seems to be, you know, it was regarded as a terrible thing by certain people. But the weird thing was that quite a lot of people liked the song. And I think this as a song, separate from Eurovision, is actually quite a good song.
Yeah.
It just did, like you were talking about the whole of Europe, including Eastern Europe, voting by text pretty much in that particular year. There was no juries, except one country had a jury because their text voting system broke down at the last minute. They had a standby jury and that was brought in. Wow. And they gave us actually 5 votes and they were the only votes we got, and that was Albania. So I've never been to Albania, but I do intend to go before I die and thank them for their, not alone for their generosity, but for their good taste, you know. But I have to say, Fergus, I mean, it was a strange event, really. I remember actually, waking up the next morning, a Sunday, in this hotel it was in Finland, what do you call the capital, Helsinki, and sitting on the side of my bed in Helsinki and trying to figure out how did it come about, not alone that I actually ended up coming last in Eurovision, but that I actually was in Eurovision in the first place. I mean, what's that about? And how did I even get there, you know? And I couldn't figure it all out in my head. It seemed to happen in all a rush, a sequence of events. And here we were. And I remember going downstairs then to breakfast, and Julian Vignoles, who was the head of the Irish delegation, which is what they call the Irish team for Eurovision, was sitting at a table, very looking disconsolate, all on his own. And I went over and sat opposite him and looked across. And I said, Julian, this is the first day of the rest of your life. And it was. And the point was, and I actually look back now and think, I'm really glad we did that. I mean, what an experience. Some of the things that happened were quite astonishing. I mean, for example, I remember the moments before the contest started. There was this kind of village, indoor village, where all the countries had their little apartments almost. You walked down these corridors and there was doors. And all the singers were out in the corridors doing their exercises as you walked along. So you would hear all these different kind of exercises and notes and so on. And I'll never forget that there was something which kind of in a way validated the song, this sense of being part of something that, you know, because you got to remember this, that whereas in Ireland and in Britain and these countries, the song the Eurovision Song Contest had come to be regarded as really passé and unhip and uncool and all that. But if you go to Eastern Europe, their very best artists were going forward because they thought it was a tremendous thing and they really wanted to be part of it and they wanted to win it. So they had their best singers, their best bands, their best dancers, their best choreographers, you name it. Whereas in Ireland, yeah, everybody was too cool for school, you know, and wouldn't get involved or interested in it. So, but I want to be clear actually about it. I mean, it's a weird thing, since you ask, that people think, well, you know, there's a certain kind of people that in Ireland that buy into Eurovision. I wouldn't regard myself necessarily as one of those people. I wasn't part of any kind of showbiz set or anything like that. I was just interested in the song contest at numerous levels in terms of the way that it kind of connected people musically and the way you learn about music and what had happened. Because one of the most fascinating things about it was that Eastern Europe, which had been behind, as it were, this wall, metaphorically in some cases, but literally in another sense, parts of it, had actually been in a certain sense shut off from much of the pop revolution that had happened on the West. And suddenly they were like catching up from.
There's a seriousness to the occasion, kind of, if you looked at through that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And what you realize is that they were fascinated with this music and really keen to do new things with it because they had learned it all together, as it were. Their whole history of pop, from Elvis to to whatever, the Smiths, was just one module. And they learned it all. They experienced it all as one thing. There was no sense of sequence. And they were coming up with entirely different things, which were really quite spectacular if you kind of were listening to them carefully. And I mean, my partner in crime was a friend from home, Tommy Moran. He was a brilliant guitar player, still is. And he was a brilliant musician. And he used to really be amazed with the kind of commentary that happened in Ireland about the contest, because he would say, they don't even listen to the songs. Like if you listen to the songs that were being produced, like in places like Sweden, they were really astonishing songs, and they went to great trouble to find out the content, to analyze the contest and analyze the audience and figure out what would work and what wouldn't work. It was a fascinating thing in this almost scientific way. And I'm thrilled. I mean, you got a lot of slagging, but I mean, as usual, the kind of people who slag you are people who haven't any interest in anything other than slagging people, you know? So, you know, if you're going to be affected by them, it doesn't really, you know, you're not going to do it very much with your life.
Yeah. No, it's absolutely right. And also they are people who didn't enter the competition either, right? The classic hurler from the ditch thing. But
yeah, well, it was a great line, actually. Michael Caine, the actor, you know, he had a great line, you know, whenever he get a bad review from a critic and he would see them, he would espy them maybe at a reception or something, and he would go up and he'd say, why don't you write a movie and I'll be in it?
Wait, say it again.
Why don't you write a movie and I'll be in it?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, which is a good line, you know?
Yes.
So
yeah, I remember I had one English teacher in particular, and he used to always just tear into films, and there was that bitterness inside of him, you know, that he hadn't done that, you know, and anyway.
Yeah.
I know what you're saying, but I want to bring this up to now, and if you don't mind, can you read me, if you have them, a couple of verses of your newest?
I actually, I can't. I'll have to read them from my phone first, because I couldn't actually get a chance to print them.
No worries.
I'll just if you just give me a moment, I'll find it and I'll read. I mean, the song you're talking about is the song which I wrote in the context of what's been happening in Ireland for the last how long? 7 months. And it seems to me also goes back to where I left my profession and my livelihood behind 5 years ago. And the song is actually, it's based on an existing song. And it's based on the song, which I came up with the word first. And I don't think that the word has previously been, even though it's a really obvious word when you think about it. And I want to explain afterwards a little bit about the word, because it sounds like kind of a little bit of vulgar abuse of my former colleagues, but it's not really. Well, it is, but it's something else as well.
I know what you mean, though. It does have a bit of a snarky, petty tone to it, doesn't it? Anyway, we should say the word first. What's the word?
The word is it's a new word for journalists. It's Journaliars, which is actually, well, I'll explain now. I mean, you see, it seems to me that this is actually more than vulgar abuse, because it's actually true that something has happened to the profession of journalism, which used to be about truth telling. That was and it was that process and that vocation was protected by all kinds of protocols and codes and conventions, and they were observed by journalists, because, that, for example, if you were going to write about something, you had to get two sides of the story. And if you were saying something about somebody, you had to actually, alert them in advance that what you were going, give them an opportunity to respond, that kind of thing. And all of that kind of went out the window about a decade or more ago as a result of probably the internet, social media. And journalists were piling onto social media, saying all kinds of things about all kinds of people, whom they would then expect to be able to turn up next day and interview without that person telling them to get lost or get stuffed or maybe even worse. And so, but the other point about it is that what's actually happened now, that the economic model of, partly as a result of that and partly as a result of the internet effect, that the economic model on which journalism was based has collapsed, generally speaking. And journalism is no longer able to sell. It's no longer able to sell itself on the old basis.
Right.
And so what actually happened is that it has now started to seek out new clients. And that those new clients are not people who want to read the truth. They are people who want to put out lies about what's actually going on. And I'm talking now generally about powerful interests, governments, and so on. And in that sense, when I call journalists journaliars, the new kind of dispensation of journalism, is actually a factual statement. It's not actually simply it's actually a description. It's an actual description that you are no longer a journalist, I say to people. You are a journaliar, because you are actually just putting out propaganda for the government. It's an amazing thing I've noticed, actually, that whereas when I came to Dublin to be a journalist. I had been working for a couple of years down the West in part-time basis for a Hot Press, this music magazine. And then I came to Dublin and was working with them full-time for a couple of years. And then I went into the mainstream. No, I went actually further into the alternative culture, then into the counterculture of magazines for a while, and then I went into the mainstream. But at that time, we were all regarded ourselves as fundamentally anti-authoritarian. Mm-hmm. We were all fundamentally rebels. We were kind of all a bit rock and roll. All journalists were a bit rock and roll. And we saw ourselves as being there to basically confront power, question power, if possible, bring down the government at least once a week. That was the kind of running gag, that certain journalists, that was their ambition, to bring down the government every day if possible. Mm-hmm. And I don't believe that was necessarily a bad ethic. I mean, you were bound to fail. You wouldn't do it every day. But if you tried, then that meant that the public had a watchdog keeping an eye on things. And that then, you see, but now if I look at the present crop of journalists in general, they're all trained in the same colleges. They're all taught by the same Marxist professors. They're all, it seems to me, totally enthralled to power. They just want to kind of do, I mean, you can see it now in this current situation with the COVID thing, where journalists are actually pumping out. They're the ones chastising each other and the public if they fail to socially distance or wear a mask or all this kind of stuff. It's really extraordinary. And yet they actually dismiss all of the codes and conventions which we honored for all our rebelliousness and for all our anti-authoritarianism. We honor the codes and principles and conventions and protocols of journalism insofar as it was an ethical practice which designed to protect democracy. And that's all gone. And so now you have, so I'll just give you, I'll give you the first verse and some of the characters in this song, you may recognize them along the way, but it may not, it doesn't really matter. But it's actually to the tune of, as people might say, of Jambalaya, the song by Hank Williams, and so it goes, goodbye, Joe, you gotta go, mio mio, you gotta quit your phone-ins on the sly-o. Talk to Joe, count my dough, ambigeo, son of a gun, we'll pull the wool every day-o. Journaliars, pants on fire, nose a mile long, should have stuck to drawing rainbows with your crayons. Lion eyes, porky pies, that's your style-o. Fabrication, that's your game, can't deny-o.
Wow.
That's so people will know the song. The Carpenters had the most successful version of that song, Jambalaya. It's kind of, I think, I mean, a lot of the words to our ears sound very unfamiliar. It's a very kind of odd kind of patois. Mm-hmm. But I guess that for Hank Williams, it was probably the language he spoke every day.
So when you brought your challenge to the High Court, you were not covered in the media, right? With any degree of seriousness, I think it's fair to say. You were covered, but not really given, I suppose. Okay.
Well,
taken seriously. Is that fair to say?
It's more interesting than that, actually, Fergus. We were covered dismissively.
Exactly.
No journalist that I know of as much as quoted a sentence from our papers. They simply repeated what the judge said, that we had submitted no arguments.
And yeah.
We had submitted something like 70 pages, densely typed pages of arguments, right? Which is not nothing. Which is not something like that, yeah. Which is not nothing. And not one sentence of that was reproduced in any Irish publication in the mainstream or referred to on any news bulletin on any of the channels that I'm aware of. And that kind of was a predictable situation because you have a situation where the media were on board for this COVID. Some people call it a scamdemic. It's not a bad word. And that we were challenging this, which once, as I say, 30 years ago, well, first of all, we wouldn't have had to do it because you would have found that a lawyer, an ex-judge, a former Minister for Justice, a former Attorney General would have said, to hell with this, I'm going to court to stop this. This is crazy stuff. It was left to two essential non-entities. Mm-hmm. legally, to actually say, and we did wait. I mean, it's very interesting. There's a guy called Michael McDowell here, and it's very, myself and Gemma already took the case. And only last week I was saying to Gemma that, because Michael McDowell came out last week and said he's now a senator. He used to be the Taoiseach, he was Deputy Prime Minister. He used to be Minister for Justice, and he used to be the Attorney General. And he was a leader of a significant political party, the Progressive Democrats. And last week he came out in the Senate. He's now a senator in the Senate, which is the upper chamber of the Irish Parliament, the Oireachtas. And he was almost crying, really, I thought, when I saw the clip, that he had no debate and he wanted a debate. But last April, when we were preparing our papers for several days over Easter, I was praying and hoping that somebody was going to stand up and say the things that we were about to say, write them down on paper. And the person that I thought of immediately was Michael McDowell, because
because that's who came to my mind. I didn't say that, but before you even mentioned his name, I had him in mind. Some strong voice who's happy to stick the neck out, kind of thing.
Exactly, sir. Because if you don't know, I mean, people may not be aware, but in the United Kingdom, there was an amazing character that came out, Jonathan Sumption, Lord Sumption, who was a former judge of the British Supreme Court, UK Supreme Court. And he came out really, really strongly from the very beginning in exactly that way, condemning the lockdown, saying that it was the greatest intrusion on civil and human rights in Britain ever in history, much worse than World War II, he said. And that was exactly what our sentiments were. And I thought, well, who is the nearest equivalent that we have in Ireland? I thought, well, probably Michael McDowell. There was no former judge of the Supreme Court that I mean, if someone like, say, there was a great judge a few years ago, he died. Adrian Hardiman. He would have been retired by now and might well have come out. But there was nobody else that I would have seen as a candidate. But certainly McDowell. And now here he is, 6 months later,
Would you not say, John, would you not say better late than never? Like, welcome to the club.
Up to a point, but it's hard to take, Fergus, when you've taken a lot of flack.
Okay.
And these guys have been watching. And they've had an opportunity to read our papers and see that they're not nothing. That contrary to what the judge tried to insinuate, because the judge knew, you see, that the papers would take anything he gave them against us and just reproduce it, which is what they did.
I'll tell you one thing that was, I suppose, shared, and I'm sure you've heard many things like this, but the High Court, and this is exactly what you're talking about, it doesn't mention what you actually said, but it only mentions the way you were characterized. The High Court refused this application in May 2020 and held that they had failed to provide any expert evidence or facts to support their view that the laws challenged were disproportionate or unconstitutional. The High Court in that decision also noted that O'Doherty and Waters had, in quotes, no medical or scientific qualifications or expertise, relied on their own unsubstantiated views, gave speeches, engaged in empty rhetoric, and sought to draw parallel to Nazi Germany, which is both absurd and offensive. Unsubstantiated opinions, speeches, empty rhetoric, and a bogus historical parallel are not a substitute for facts. So there's actually no time there to say what was the case that you two were trying to make.
Well, let me just first of all say what you wouldn't at all deduce from that summary, that what we were engaged in, or what we understood we were engaged in, and what we were factually engaged in, was an application for leave for judicial review. That is a preliminary process, and the only requirement that you need to reach in such a process is that you demonstrate that there are questions of constitutionality in a particular piece of legislation, for example, and that there is an arguable case in that regard. You don't have to have scientific evidence. A blind man on a galloping horse might have passed by the Four Courts or any street of Dublin in the month of March last year or April and said, there's something up here. There's something seriously wrong. I wonder, do these people have any constitution? They don't seem to be, they seem to have lost all their entitlements and freedoms. They must have no constitution. And then he would inquire. And then he might get an envelope in a stationery shop. And on the back of it, he might write something like the following. the constitution of this country has been overturned illegally, and this needs to be investigated by those who have sworn an oath to uphold the constitution, i.e. the judiciary. And he might then have ridden his blind horse around to the four courts and handed that envelope to a judge who would be duty bound by his own oath to investigate that charge immediately. So the allegation that we had no evidence, we had the evidence of the unconstitutionality at great length set out in our papers, not one sentence of which was reproduced by the media. The sentences which the judge alludes to there were not in our papers.
Wow.
They were ad hoc comments which were taken out of context by the judge, which were stated by us from the floor. One of them, by the way, which you didn't refer to there, was he took offense because I mentioned that Lord Sumption in Britain had actually said certain things about the lockdown there, which could be applied also to our situation. Mm-hmm. And he reminded me that Lord Sumption was a British judge and this was Ireland. So that was the level of pomposity that we were dealing with. But look, the point is that we are dealing with a profoundly corrupted culture now in Ireland. That, you see, virtually every agency and every office and every institution has been captured. And what is going on here now in Ireland and in the world generally is essentially, it has been called this before, and I'll call it this again, it is a form of almost a global coup, you would call it. It is an attempt to derogate the constitutional protections that have existed in our Western civilization for many centuries. And in our case, for 80 years in the form of the 1937 Constitution, which is probably one of the best constitutions in the world still, although it has sustained a lot of damage in the last decade from referendums, which were won by propaganda and lies, but that's another story. So what you're dealing with here is, for example, the reference to Nazi Germany is the kind of thing that media would love to say. But what the judge did not say, and what the media didn't seek to discover, because it was there in the transcripts, was that the allusion to Nazi Germany took the following form. That Jim O'Doherty, my colleague, said in the course of one submission to the court, an oral submission, that we were now reduced to having to carry papers and identification with us as we went around. And that this was the kind of thing that happened previously in Nazi Germany, and that it didn't happen, generally speaking, in democratic societies. I think that's a reasonable observation. It is a reasonable observation. And the judge clearly mischaracterized that and grotesquely mischaracterized it to the merriment of the Journaliars who love that kind of thing. That's what happened. But we have made our appeal, we have submitted our appeal. It comes before the Court of Appeal for directions hearing on the 9th of March, which is the 9th of October. Mm-hmm. And we intend to proceed from there. The situation has changed dramatically. Whereas 6 months ago, what we appeared to be saying was a deeply unpopular view. And now it is an increasingly popular view. It is now an increasingly widespread view. So I don't think that the same conditions apply now, although the Journaliars will probably do their best to ensure that that situation is repeated. Yeah, I would be surprised as we work our way up through the judiciary. I mean, this is a fundamental of the judicial system, that the quality of judging improves, it has to be said, as you go up, inevitably, and for obvious reasons. And I would imagine that still, despite everything, there may be judges at the top tier, at the top table, who have a high degree of intellect, a high degree of integrity, and a high degree of patriotism.
Well, John, it doesn't take a lawyer to be aware of the social effect or the social phenomenon, right? So you've obviously seen 12 Angry Men.
Yes.
It's not that, like in the beginning, it's 11-1. And at the end, it's completely flipped. And it's not like those 12 people were stupid at the start and then became enlightened. But through the course of the interaction, certain things were brought up that weren't brought up before. Yes. But there was also the phenomenon of, and this is a natural thing, and I think we should point out, like, people do want to fit in. People don't want to upset their families. People don't want to be the one fella like John Waters, like the one fella who everyone is abusing and who doesn't get to enjoy a peaceful walk down the pier. Do you know what I mean? So there is, like, while maybe they are neglecting their duties, I think that's a reasonable argument that you might make. But at the same time, it is understandable when you look at the consequences on a personal level, and that's not to say that it makes it right. Do you know? So I just think of some. Yeah, go on.
I hear exactly what you're saying, and you're exactly right. You've hit the nail on the head there, in the sense that, you know, probably the thing people most fear, the most feared thing, is not necessarily hunger or pain. It's actually the fear of being excluded, the fear of being banished from your group,
or humiliated
from society. You know, that's when you go back to, like, you look at the Catholicism and the concept of excommunication. This was the worst thing that could be done to you, to excommunicate you. And that's great fear. Now, I'm in a certain sense blessed again, or cursed.
You've already been there.
It's never really bothered me that much.
Yeah.
No, the idea of being driven out of groups. I've never really belonged to groups, but I mean, the idea of being, but I have had friends. I thought were friends who have kind of long since headed for the hills, you know, and that's fine. But I think that, you see, there's a fundamental thing here which is really interesting, and which really worries me more than anything, and should worry people a lot. When, you know, I read up on the kind of people who were in and around government in, say, the early years of independence, the first few decades of independence, a time of great strife and turmoil in Ireland, you know, where there was, like, you know, skirmishes on a regular basis in the streets, and there was, you know, executions and all kinds of stuff going on, and summary courts and whatnot. Nevertheless, when you actually read into that period, it's astonishing to find the degree of patriotism that existed among the political class, the civil servants, and those kinds of people, judges in particular, who were so obsessively intent upon protecting public freedoms that they warned again and again about precisely the kind of thing that had happened here last March and happened right around the world in those weeks and month or so last spring. That, you know, governments basically moved in on the fundamental rights and freedoms of their own citizens and took them away from them summarily, without any discussion of any kind of democratic nature whatsoever. I mean, there was I've repeatedly said it in court, that there was in this country in the spring, multiple organ failure of Irish democracy, that every single organ of our protections of our democracy failed. The government failed, the executive, the Oireachtas, the parliament, both houses, the Dáil and Seanad, failed. The media failed, the Fourth Estate failed, and the legal profession failed to stand up. The judiciaries failed to stand up. The former judges failed to stand up. The former ministers failed to stand up. Nobody. It was left to two people who were then, you know, attacked by the very people who should have been doing this.
Yes.
Whose job it was to do this. You see, this is the astonishing thing. And not only were we actually shot down in the brusque and ignorant manner that we were, but we were then imposed with massive costs for a process which should not have happened, because what the judge actually tried to do in order to skewer us was to extend the leave hearing into a full hearing, knowing that we, of course, were not ready for a full hearing at that point. We were merely seeking leave for a full hearing. And the normal thing would be that you would, if you got leave, you would have a few weeks to prepare your witnesses and so on. Okay. And he was intent upon denying us that. So there was a fundamental breach of natural justice at the heart of our case. Mm-hmm. And it needs to be said, and in any kind of civilized society, that would have been pointed out by a journalist or by a leading lawyer, mm-hmm. but not one person emerged to say so.
So how did you pay the costs? Do you mind me asking? Like, was it hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands?
I have no idea what it is, Fergus, and I don't care. We're not paying it, and we're not. We are going to win this case eventually.
You know what came to mind there? The water protest. No way, we won't pay. So you can bring that back.
Well, it's not so much that we're not, I mean, you see, there's a principle of natural justice that citizens are entitled and indeed obliged to have a responsibility to draw the court's attention to things that are wrong constitutionally. That's a fundamental responsibility of any good citizen. And it is absolutely iniquitous and egregious for a judge then to try to punish people who simply do that in what is, by any stretch, by any definition, the worst and most egregious instance of breaching of fundamental rights that we have seen in our time of independence.
This was an intentional belittling, would you say, as opposed to you lost the case and this is the consequence? You think there was an added kind of malice to this?
Well, we didn't lose the case at all. I mean, the case was never tried because
that you were dismissed.
Not a single line of our submissions is listed in the judgment. Not a single line. In to say that this is wrong. Mm-hmm. It's all stuff that happened off the cuff in exchanges from the floor.
So what happens now, John?
Well, we go to the Court of Appeal. We have submitted a series of criticisms of the judge's performance, which amounts to I think something like 70 separate points.
Wow.
And we have submitted that, and that is now, as I say, appearing. There's a directions hearing on the 9th of October, and from there we presume there will be a hearing of that appeal, and at that point we will either be granted leave for judicial review, and then the process will start, as I said, in that way, and we will have our evidence, our witnesses, our expert witnesses, our papers, all of that will be submitted. Or alternatively, if we lose at this, or at the appeal stage, we will go to the Supreme Court and the same thing will obtain there. And in the event that we win at the Supreme Court, we will go back then for judicial review and have to work our way up again. But you see, there's a fundamental problem here, Fergus, which people will not be aware of. But, you know, the Irish state is comprised of about 300 odd people at any given time, really. The state itself, that is the executive of government. Mm-hmm. The Parliament, the Oireachtas, and the judiciary, something like 300 odd people. And that is the state. Now, there's a real paradox here that when you seek to challenge wrongdoing by the state, you end up in courts which are presided over by people from among this number. Mm-hmm. So there's a requirement there, therefore, that a judge, all of our judges are appointed by politicians, which is a very, very problematic thing. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't have really good judges. We have had and great judges in the past. And what I would say, what is a great judge? Well, a great judge is somebody who is trained in the process of objectivity, that is capable of actually disentangling his or her own prejudices from an issue and looking objectively, squarely at the facts and at the law. And that's a rare thing now, because as you see in the United States, like the discussions which happen around the question of the Supreme Court now are entirely about what the political affiliation will be of the nominee for the Supreme Court. This is completely nonsensical in a sense, in the sense that all judges, they may have different perspectives. They may be conservative or liberal, but that means that they are conservative in their interpretation of how the law should act. It doesn't mean that they bring a conservative set of political views to their job. That is not what it means. And, although it does translate as much the same thing, because you have this kind of different mentality now, what they call presentism, where our constitutions are being applied, not according to the letter written at the time of their formation, but of the attitudes and views of the present moment. And this is a big, very controversial thing. But you see, the problem is when you have judges who have a sense of obligation to those who appoint them, you have a real fundamental democratic problem, mm-hmm. and a huge problem for the rule of law. And unfortunately, that's going to be a problem for us as we go up through the system. But at the end of the day, I have been saying from the start that this is not so much it is, of course, a legal action, but it's also a drama. That what we are doing, we are dramatizing as we go along the struggle that the people of Ireland need to fight against those who rule them. and those who have essentially appropriated the instruments of power and are misusing them against the Irish people. And that's what we intend to keep doing. And you know, let the pieces fall where they may.
John, can I pause you for a second, and can we take a 2-minute break?
Sure.
There was someone knocking on the door here, and I have to answer the door. So
okay, all right.
Sorry, I'm the only one here. Give us 2 minutes. Right? I'm going to put the mute on and stop the video, and I'll just see you back in 2 minutes. Is that all right?
Perfect.
Right, thanks a minute. John, it was the census.
Oh man, did you fill it all out?
No, apparently it had already been filled out for me on my behalf, I think, in the previous place I was living. So anyway, he's gone now, you know. So
am we okay there light wise? Can you see me?
I wanted to ask you, yeah, if maybe you could move back a little bit and or in some other way. Yeah, you're lit better now. That looks good.
I'll do that.
Yeah, so the I want to shift, not really shift directions, but go in a slightly different direction here.
Okay.
But the term conspiracy theorist has certain connotations with it, and you often hear it associated with anti-vax sentiments, 9/11 conspiracy theories, tinfoil hat wearing, 5G, climate denying, maybe even the flat earth conspiracy. So just before we delve into this, how do you feel about that label? What do you think it means? And what do you think is meant by it? And then by extension, how would you feel if people started saying, oh, they're conspiracy theorists in relation to what you're putting forth at this moment in time about what's going on?
Well, the phrase conspiracy theory or theorist is actually very interesting because, first of all, it was invented by the CIA for a very clear purpose, which was to actually do exactly what you described, which is to daub certain forms of thought with an indelible ink that would stick to the fingers of anybody who touched them, and to the faces and the noses and the ears of everybody who listened or tried to see what was there. Now, it's a very interesting phrase when you think about it. There are two words in it: conspiracy theory. And the word conspiracy has very sinister undertones for obvious reasons, right? Now, but when you think about it, virtually everything that happened historically, every battle, every war, every revolution, was the result of a conspiracy. There were conspirators who planned these events, right? So all the great events of history are the result of conspiracies. So to have a theory about conspiracies that may or may not be happening in the present is not in any way a sinister thing. The conspiracies may or may not be sinister themselves. I mean, they may be, but they may be good conspiracies in the long run. Historically, they may come to be viewed as good things. But the sinister undertones of the word nevertheless endure. But what the phrase conspiracy theory does in its effect is to flip the words. So the sinister implications are imbued not on the word conspiracy, but on the word theory. So the theorist becomes, the person who has the sinister kind of intent. This is a really interesting phrase, because there's a variation then. There's another word which you don't hear so much, but is very much part of this thought process. And that the actor in the conspiracy theory, in the conspiracy, the actor is the conspirator. In the conspiracy theory, the actor is the conspiracist. And that's a fascinating distinction. So it's a magical use of words. There's no doubt about it. You've got to give the devil his due, because what it achieves is that it inoculates certain ideas from scrutiny. For example, you talk about vaccination. You use, again, another spell word, another kind of magical phrase or a spell word, anti-vax. Well, I know lots of people who have questions about vaccinations of various kinds. I actually don't know anybody who is outrightly opposed to vaccination as a concept in principle. There are people who simply say, yeah, but we need to ensure that these vaccinations are safe. We need to have transparency with regard to the testing of these. We need to know the full facts about their records and so on and so forth. But the term anti-vax is created in the same way as the term conspiracy theory, in order to, because as soon as actually somebody uses one of these phrases, the way I thought, it's actually like a cattle prod, that you are touched by it and you recoil from whatever the subject is. I don't want to go there. I'm not one of those people. So give me the vaccination, to prove it. In order to prove I'm not an anti-vaxxer, I'll take anything. Go on.
And leave me alone then.
That's kind of the logic. And the same goes for, you listed out quite a few there. There's different views on each of those. My point is this: say for something like the 5G. Journalism all in Ireland and in the world now immediately lapses into a smirk as soon as somebody raises a question about 5G. And yet, when you ask those who are involved, who have investment in 5G, for the documented proof of the safety of that technology, they're unable to provide it. And I say the point of journalism is not to smirk at anything. The point of journalism is to stage a discussion between those who believe in something and those who don't believe in it, those who support something and those who oppose it. And out of that discussion ought to come some kind of settled understanding as to what is true about this subject. That is what journalism is. It is not there to bully the one side or the other into silence, which is what it has become. And that's a related syndrome to the syndrome of journaliar, which I spoke about earlier. That, journalists feel that their role is to kind of, adopt. It's amazing, the corporate view, the powerful view, the authoritarian view, as opposed to being the view of the person in the street who is powerless, resourceless in many instances, who doesn't know how to find out information him or herself, and is depending on these people, these high priests of the media, to inform them and educate them and protect their interests. And that's no longer happening. And that's what I have to say about the term conspiracy theorist. I mean, again, like a lot of other phrases which have erupted in the recent past, homophobia, racism, these are all spell words. Roger Scruton, the great English philosopher who died earlier this year, described them as such, and it's a very good way of describing it. That they're not just words of description or words of illumination or words of comprehension. They're actually spells which actually change the chemistry of a situation, of a person's mentality towards a particular question, by deterring them from resisting the demands of a particular group, or from having any kind of alliance, or even listening to people who are tarred with those particular words. And that's become a feature of our democracy, so-called, particularly in the last 20 years. It's very much part of what is called culture of Marxism. It's very part of the whole concept of political correctness, which is much more sinister than you would think, because people tend to think of political correctness as a kind of jokey, kind of excessive, exaggerated politeness towards different kinds of people. In fact, it's a very rigid form of censorship, and mind control, which has been hugely successful again in our cultures, in achieving a kind of silence around certain questions.
I think as sinister as the intention might be, or like you say, as insufferable as that smirk might be on the face when the term conspiracy theorist is used, I do think there's a certain usefulness in the term, because certain people, like, it's a kind of a team of people. Like, you hear some people say, I woke up at this point, right? There's one friend of mine I can think of in particular, and she buys into, I use that term lightly, but she adopts a lot of these suspicions about what's really going on, right? And I think you have really started maybe looking into or questioning everything as a result of the questions that have been brought up for you as a result of all the coronavirus stuff. Is that fair to say? Do you think you're treating, for example, the 5G thing or the vaccine thing? I don't know, would you ever have thought twice about these kind of things, say 2 years ago? Or maybe 2 years ago, maybe you would, but 5 years ago, do you know what I mean? Like, something.
Well, I don't think that's the issue. The issue is nothing to do with my position.
No, but something happened recently for you.
What's happened is that in relation to vaccines, I mean, I have a daughter and she's vaccinated with all the traditional vaccines, unquestioningly, at the time, and because they were tried and trusted vaccines. Now the number of vaccines which children are required to get has absolutely exploded. It's become exponential. And most of these vaccines are unknown and untested, inadequately tested. I mean, there's been innumerable stories about Bill Gates vaccinating people in India and Africa, particularly young women, and those women ending up sterilized as a result of those vaccinations. That's something which we know for a fact. And yet this is never alluded to in the mainstream media. What you have to look at then is ask yourself, well, what is Bill Gates's role? I mean, how come Bill Gates gets to be called, that the word philanthropist seems to be stuck with superglue to his name. And it appears every time he's mentioned in the media, he's described as a philanthropist. Well, let me tell you that the Bill Gates Foundation, like the Clinton Foundation and all the other foundations under American law, operate on the basis that for every dollar you donate, you put into your operation, you get 95% back in tax rebates over the next 5 years. So for $5 cents in the dollar, Bill Gates gets to be called a philanthropist, as opposed to a blackguard or something worse. So, you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist. You just have to know what's true. And this idea like that nothing's changed. I mean, lots of stuff is changing now in the world. And that's just on vaccines. I mean, the COVID thing is a very complicated story. But what we do know for a fact is that if you look at the figures now that have emerged after 6 months, in America, in Ireland, in Italy, that only a tiny fraction of the people who were supposed to have died from COVID-19 actually died of that actual condition. And
you talk about the 6% thing in America, like
yes,
that kind of thing.
Yes, yeah. The CDC has said that 6%, and the average age of those in general is something like 82, 83, 84 years of age. Now, I'm not going to say that death is, any easier when you're 84 than as if you're 44. But facts of life tell us that, in Ireland, the average life expectancy is 82. So there's something else going on here, has been going on here for a long time. So you don't need to be a conspiracy theorist to actually hold that view. There's lots and lots and lots and lots of evidence. And in fact, now you would actually have to conclude the contrary, that the mainstream journalists who are talking about a pandemic and warning us that, there's going to be a million people dead in America by Christmas, or whatever the latest figure that they roll off the top of their head, that's the conspiracy theory. They're the conspiracy theorists. There's something else going on. We already know it. The British economy, for example, I was talking to an economist today who works there, and he says that the economy is now in such a state that 2008 is like, they wish it could be 2008 again. Mm-hmm. The economy has completely collapsed. The British Treasury has withdrawn the furlough payment now, and that has revealed in all its darkness the reality of what has happened to the British economy, which has been concealed by this payment every week to people who are laid off or furloughed. Now, in Ireland, we've actually prolonged our payment. We've reduced it from 350 to 300, although there is some dispute about that. They're trying to revise that. And it's extended next February. And that is nothing less than an attempt to conceal, to camouflage the nature of the calamity that has actually struck us. And so the result is that people seem to think that they're still on holiday. They're getting the money every week. It puts food on the table. They say, okay, well, the government will look after us because, it's their doing. And we'll just have to hope for, in a very short time, a matter of months, maybe weeks, they're going to know the truth, that this is the greatest calamity that ever struck the Irish economy. And the consequences of that will unfold. They're already unfolding, but they're being suppressed. The number of suicides, I believe that the number of suicides has gone up by something of the order of 50%.
Really?
But that has not been officially confirmed. The figures have not been published. And so on. So in Ireland, we were told there were something like 1,700 deaths, which, now it turns out that the actual number is 73 or 76, beg your pardon.
76?
76.
Where did that number come from?
That's a CSO figure. When you actually look at the only meaningful statistic, which is the excess deaths for the period.
The excess deaths for the period is 76 people.
76 people appear to have died of what is called COVID-19. Now, when you consider that 85 people die in Ireland every day, you get some perspective from that.
85 die every day?
Yes.
Okay.
So this has been a monumental con.
So for you, John, it is abundantly clear that this is a con job. I remember you said to me on the phone the other day, you're 99.99999%.
Yes, well, I mean, that's purely for the sake that I will always be a little bit doubtful about.
I know, of course, and you wouldn't hope that you would be, 100% convinced of anything. But let me just ask you, there are people, obviously, this isn't a complicated point to make. There are people, obviously, 99.999% convinced of the alternative view. And I want to ask you, how, like, what really for you was the turning point that made you say, hold on a second, like, I don't really buy into this? Because I do remember, and this isn't to diminish your stance now at all, but I do remember you saying that a few months ago you were wearing the gloves and sanitizing the hands, and you were doing what you were asked to do, and yes, you no longer buy into all of that. So what happened to you, and what would you say if you were invited by Cormac O'Hara to come on into the Montrose area and debate someone, what would you be saying to them to say?
Okay, well,
whatever.
First of all, I mean, yeah, what you say is true, except just to be clear or to clarify.
Yeah.
When I was speaking before about wearing the gloves, I probably had long since moved beyond that phase.
Yes.
I mean, that was a relatively short phase.
Fair enough.
Now, there's a few things. First of all, we had been my wife and I had been in Rome in February, and when we were there was rumors of a big outbreak up north in Lombardy. But there was no evidence in Rome itself that there was any pandemic. Although I gathered afterwards that the first 2 cases initially were actually in Rome, but I don't know, never heard anything about that again, and never saw any evidence of it, as I say. And people were just behaving normally. There was a few people wearing masks, but they're mainly Asians, and you know, because they tend to wear masks all the time, I think, anyway. So when we got back, literally on the 28th of April, it was the day before the first case in Ireland. And there was a little bit of activity in Dublin Airport. There was some HSE people there, but nobody was bothering about them. But you see, I had been ill twice very seriously over the previous 2 years. And I mean, first time with cancer, kidney cancer, and I had a major operation for that. And then a year later, I had a massive viral attack, a real viral attack, let me tell you. A syndrome called Ramsay-Hunt syndrome, which has left me deaf in my left ear and has basically paralyzed the left side of my face, which has come around a little bit, but not, maybe about 50%. Mm-hmm. But it's still a bit, it's not ideal. So I was concerned about the possibility that my immune system might be seriously depleted.
Yes.
And I did actually at the beginning. I mean, there was no reason not to. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I was no reason to mistrust the information I was getting because it seemed to be genuine. And what we were hearing from Italy seemed to be genuine, and increasingly from Spain. And so, I mean, I went through this rigmarole. I mean, we had a box of rubber gloves on the kitchen table, and I thought, well, and they were hard to get, and also sanitizer was hard to get. So I was getting worried, and would we have enough gloves? There was only 100 pairs in the box, and what were we going to do when it ran out? So I started recycling them and all this. And so I went through this every day. I would get up and when I was going out, I would wash my hands, right? I'd dry my hands. I'd worry about the towel. How many times had I used that towel before? But I'll change it tomorrow, or I'll change it later. And then I would put on the gloves, and then I would think, well, maybe I need to wash my gloves now while they're on. And then I would go out I would live in an apartment block, and I would go out to the front door, and then I would I'd open the door, and oh my God, I'm after touching the handle. I have to go home and change. I have to go back and change my glove. All this palaver went on. Or I go down the street and I'd forget and touch the button on the traffic light. Yes. Oh my God, it's all ruined. All this went on for several days. And in the end, people were saying to me, I was meeting people, or I was talking to people who were skeptical, because I do know quite a few conspiracy theorists. And they were saying to me, come on, and I was having real arguments with them, and I said, no, this sounds serious. And I was into, there was a couple of people that I trusted who were giving me information, and that we were doing panic buying was big at the time, and all that. And then a few things happened. I mean, one of them was that I watched this video. Somebody sent me a video by a German doctor called Wolfgang Wodarg. And he went through methodically to the whole concept of coronaviruses, where he explained that we have multiple coronaviruses in our system all the time, but there's just not enough most of the time to make us ill. And that if you do a test of us, you will find one or other of these, or maybe several of them. And he went through several points like this, and I was saying, I could see a certain pattern here. And at the end, he said, which really was to me a big stretch, he said, this is Emperor's New Clothes. I thought, no, come on, that's pushing it. But then there's a brilliant journalist in Britain called Peter Hitchens, who had started writing about it. And I remember at this time, the laws were being framed in both Britain and Ireland, and there was talk in Britain that they were going to go for the herd immunity route, and then they changed their minds and they went for the major lockdown. And Hitchens was against it. And that was one thing that happened. Another thing that happened was I started to hear certain things on the wind, because I was writing for First Things, and I wrote an article for First Things, which was published on the 18th of March, which is in a strange way was extraordinarily prophetic. because it was about old people. And it was about the fact that the threat to old people that seemed to be represented not so much by the virus, but by the attitude to the virus, that people were talking about, in a sense, as though the old people were dispensable, and that triage systems could be constructed to exclude them, and were being in hospitals. You know, in other words, that the old people over 80 in one hospital were not being treated, people over 75 in another. Then you would hear about one over 70s not being treated, over 65 not being treated. And then I saw an interview with an Israeli doctor who said on Israeli television that he had been told in his hospital in Parma that they were not to treat anybody over 60. So I wrote something about this, the ominous nature of this, and the idea that, you know, if you have a virus that is disproportionately attacks older people, and then you don't treat the older people, well, what's going to happen next? You're going to have a lot of dead bodies, surely. And that's what happened. So all of this was making me this is the way I operate, Fergus, you see, and I think this is the way any rational person operates. They take precautions where there appears to be a danger, and then they inform themselves of the facts. And then I came across other doctors. There's a brilliant doctor also in Germany called Dr. Sucharat Bhakti, who I came upon through reading Peter Hitchens and listening to Peter Hitchens on the radio. And Peter Hitchens was on the radio, on talk radio in London every Monday with a guy called Mike, God, what's his name? Anyway, Mike, he's a very unlikely companion for Peter because they're very different. Mike was of the view that the lockdown was justified and Peter wasn't. And at the beginning, they were hammer and tongs. They're still at it. They're still talking, but now they're like best buddies. Wow. Because Mike has come to the view, Mike Graham has come to the view that Peter Hitchens was right about everything. Although he still holds to his original view that the lockdown was justified at the time. So I was following this every week, avidly. And I was reading all kinds of stuff from all kinds of Dr. John Ioannidis from Stanford University was brilliant. There was Shiva Ayadurai, an American doctor, an Indian doctor working in America, who was brilliant. Dr. Rashid Buttar. There was all these guys who were really quite exceptional in the way they explained different facets of the whole thing. And this was quite different. I don't follow the media in Ireland, but what I was picking up second or third hand from the media was like there was nothing of this. There was none of this being put out at all. This understanding of the nature of it. And in recent times, more recently, I've come across a brilliant guy from Ontario in Canada called, I would pronounce it Denis Rancourt, but I think he's French speaking, so he calls himself Denis Rancourt. And he's a multidisciplinary scientist, physics, chemistry, biochemistry, all kinds of things. And he's done several papers now on this with himself and with others, about different aspects of it. And he's come to a very definitive analysis of the situation, which is that the nature of the problem, the nature of what happened can be summarized as a form of homicide by government policy. He doesn't specify whether he regards it as intentional or otherwise. I think he doesn't really intend to suggest it's necessarily intentional. It may well be a form of negligence.
Is this the peak you're talking, or the spike, or whatever?
Yes. Essentially, he had identified, and this was something I noticed if you look on a site called Euromomo, which has all the mortality figures for Europe over the past number of years, or going back as far, I don't know how long they go back. But if you look at a chart which shows, say, the last 5 years, and you see this series of mountain ranges effectively in each year, which, you know, there's high mortality. The mortality burden for winter is much higher than for the summer. And so you see this, and they vary somewhat year to year, but there's a pattern in them that is quite consistent at the same time. And then you come to this odd thing on the top of the 2020 peak, which was kind of low comparatively before the COVID thing. You find this extraordinary spike in lots and lots of places, not everywhere, but in lots and lots of places. This spike, which was really quite acute and quite extraordinary, quite artificial. And Professor Rancourt analyzes this, and what he says is that this occurred in nursing homes in these places, where there was a panic generated. People were locked in. The air was bad. There was no sunlight. They were denied the love and companionship of their families and friends. They weren't being treated if they become ill with other conditions. They weren't being properly, they weren't taken to hospital. People were coming back in who were infected, staff and patients who were not being tested. And I would add that many of these people would have been religious, certainly in Ireland, and they were being denied the ministrations of a priest at a time when they were led to believe that they were dying of a deadly disease. Now, he says that this happened in a period which is very narrow comparative to most years. Most years, like say, their death burden extends from maybe early December through to early March or even beyond. So it's a 2 to 3 months, three month period. This was like a matter of like 3, 4, or 5 weeks, depending on that this slim, like icicle, inverted icicle, could be seen in a multiplicity of countries, not all, and he goes into that as well, that the deaths really occurred in that way in New York, for example, in America, in France, in Sweden, even though Sweden didn't have a lockdown, they did have that burden of a high proportion of elderly people dying. They also have, incidentally, a much higher proportion of elderly people than other countries for all kinds of reasons, than other neighboring countries or for their other European countries. So that's his analysis. And to my mind, it fits the general patterns, but it expressly fits the Irish situation. Because in Ireland, if mindful of what I said, that the number of deaths, according to the CSO now, is something like 76 of people who did not have multiple underlying conditions, and so on. That nevertheless, the 1777 was the official figure for a long time for Irish deaths. It still is in the media because they don't want to tell you the truth. But of that figure, well over 1,000 died in nursing homes. Now, when you consider that only a tiny microscopic proportion of the population lives in nursing homes, that's a startling thing.
So is it 76 or is it the massive spike? Like which is the, okay, do you know what I mean? If it's only 76.
Well, okay, well then we have to drill into it, because what you're talking about then is the spike is the representation of the statistics which are prepared by each government, by each jurisdiction. And as we saw in multiple places, the methodology for the certification of death was extraordinary, where they were actually saying, essentially, this came up when the Oireachtas committee the other day in Ireland, investigation, where the chairman, who was a solid guy, Michael McNamara, solid guy, he's getting it, and although it's over now, but he got it, and he asked the question, well, if some fellow, like, essentially he says, if he falls off a roof but he tests positive for COVID and he dies in hospital, what's he put down as? Well, he's put down as COVID. If
he tests positive, yeah.
So this is what's been happening, and that's where the spikes come from. So you see, going back to nursing homes, you have to remember, I've talked to numerous doctors about this, and what the picture I get from them is this: people who worked in nursing homes. Like one of them said to me, well, look, if you go into the nursing home and somebody's died, you're confronted by a dead body, but you don't know what they died of. And the chances are, he said, that that person died, most people, he says, die of one thing, of multiple organ failure. But that may have been accelerated at the end by pneumonia, which is related to the underlying conditions and to the depleted immune system.
Yeah.
Because Professor Rancourt explains this. He says that what is called COVID-19 is not a deadly disease. What actually it is simply that something that, like the flu, if somebody has already multiple conditions which their immune system is fighting to keep under control, and that person gets an added infection, let it be COVID or let it be the flu or something else, that their immune system, as it were, deflects to deal with the intruder.
Okay.
And while that's happening, then their general condition deteriorates and they die. That's kind of what happens, right? But they haven't died of the COVID or the flu as such. Very rarely would you. But maybe pneumonia is the trigger that is going to tip them over. all of the, this is the way so when we see then all of these deaths in nursing homes, we're talking about people who might have died in that period anyway.
Of other things.
Or of other things. There are also people who might have died in the next 3 months or the next 6 months or the next year.
So is that how the figure is so low, maybe? Because these people died maybe prematurely by a few months. Is that what you're saying?
There's an element of that. There's also something to be said about the fact that in most jurisdictions, including particularly Ireland, for whatever reason, that the burden of the winter burden of deaths up to the point of March the 11th, when was the first death from COVID, had been relatively low, had been a very low year. So there would have been, in that context, quite a lot of people who would have been very vulnerable. The sociologists have a terrible phrase for this, or the epidemiologists, they call it dry tender.
Yes.
So that's also a factor. So what you have is, and when you examine then the Central Statistic Office figures, what you're actually seeing is that there is this spike in April, starting in late March, ending in mid-May, back to earth in mid-May. But that all around it, there are troughs. That it has actually, as it were, it has harvested the deaths from all around itself. And that's essentially what the phenomenon of COVID deaths amounts to.
So, John, would you say that in, say, May, there were fewer deaths in Ireland than in a typical May?
Yes, there were.
Because in March and April, there were more deaths.
Well, maybe not May, but certainly in June, yes. And I don't have the figures in front of me now, but April is high. May is high as well, but as the month goes on, it decreases and goes way down. So overall, what they're saying, the CSO is saying that for a period of, say, the 6-month period up to the end of June, that there are only something like 76 excess deaths. And this is again what Rancourt says. He says that all cause mortality is the factor, the only way you can actually measure the true effect of a pandemic.
Year on year and all that, yeah.
Yes, because people die in all kinds of ways, of all kinds of things, and it's complicated. And as he says, the certification of death is a political business, particularly in a situation like this, where there's a demand and a pressure on doctors to certify deaths in a particular way. And that's something that hasn't been really talked about. The astonishing thing is, again, going back to the whole question of debate, I've only seen Professor Rancourt on YouTube, on videos. You don't hear his name coming from the media sector. And yet he's absolutely astonishing in his grasp of the whole thing. And, I would have said, well, look, people may pick holes in what he says. By all means, let them do it if they can. But surely we should be having these discussions out in public so people can make up their own minds about, and actually maybe, moderate their views in some way, or actually maybe qualify their views, or indeed to sharpen up their views with regard to what happened. And yet, so the policy seems to be, as we see in Ireland here, we had one doctor who came out, Dr. Feely there, came out about 3 weeks ago. He was immediately fired from his job because he questioned the lockdown.
Is this the fellow who was at the march or the protest?
No, he wasn't at the march. He was simply a HSE Health Service Executive Doctor who just offered a very modest and concerned opinion that we were actually this had gone on too long and it was time to get the country back, and that many people were dying of other causes. This is a factor as well, which is being concealed, because you can imagine, Fergus, people who have been denied. Maybe we haven't seen the spike of this yet, but certainly we will have had some instances of it in those figures, lost in those figures, whereby people who have not been diagnosed with conditions that might otherwise have been picked up have died, whether it's heart failure or something like that. The hospital services essentially closed down for 5-6 months. And that they've died, and that perhaps their deaths have been attributed to COVID as well, which is an extraordinary irony. So we're seeing something here, which, if you want to then start to speculate, which I think it is a certain degree of speculation, although there is some evidence that there is something going on which is much bigger than this. And, you know, I will simply observe that it has been remarkable in Ireland that since the beginning of the lockdown, that we saw the first thing in at the end, to go back to your conspiracy theories, the installation of 5G was rolled out immediately for several weeks. You saw nothing but electrical suppliers and vans along the road putting up these masts and putting up these things on lighting poles and so on. The second thing that happened then was that around here, bicycle lanes were being put in everywhere. You know, I mean, in the road I live in, what used to be a 2-lane road, it was actually a main arterial road from the south of the state, from the South County into Dublin. It's now been reduced to a single lane in one direction, you know, and the other half of the road is a 2-lane cycle lane. It's like a racetrack. Mm-hmm. It's quite extraordinary. And
remember you telling me about that, yeah.
Like, you just have to ask, well, what is that about? And I mean, again, you know, it's about the green agenda. It's about climate change. And there are those who say there's a profound connection between COVID and climate change. Again, you know, I have certain views on this, but you see, there's a great danger when you start to speak about these things, again, in this climate where you have journaliars looking for some hook to justify, you know, an attack on your credibility or your integrity, is to say, well, this is, I don't think there's any necessity to go beyond really analyzing the figures, pointing out the patterns, asking the questions. And if I were still working for the Irish media, that's what I would do. But the chance, of course, the paradox is that if I was still doing that, I wouldn't be working for the Irish media for very long.
Yes, but again, I don't want to repeat myself or make you repeat yourself, right, unnecessarily. I genuinely want to establish that what's going on with the spike, and if it is a relatively let's say, if it's a disease or a condition that isn't as threatening as we are led to believe,
yes,
what is causing the spike? Is it that too many deaths are being recorded as being caused by this, or is it that the fear was condensed into a particular finite amount of time, when normally the people dying is a, let's say, more moderately
yes,
up
yes,
and down
exactly,
kind of,
Fergus. That's exactly it. I mean, what I would say is this, that the COVID thing, it's interesting. It started almost at exactly the moment that the winter phase, the winter flu season ended, the 1st of March. That's kind of roughly the time when it ends, unless you have a particularly very savage early spring. That's when it ends, right? In Ireland and the United Kingdom, for example, very definitely, and in most of Europe. So what you have then is this, you know, what Professor Rancourt is saying is that you had, you see, there's one important point that I left out of his analysis, which is that he believes psychological stress, he says, is a big factor, particularly for old people in the acceleration of serious illness. And he believes that the conditions that were created artificially as a result of the World Health Organization's diktats and the panic generated by that, and particularly the panic generated in the media, where people in their nursing homes would have TV sets in their wards and they were pumping out the stats, the death stats every minute of every day, that this panic generated an intense period of illness, of exacerbated illness, that, you know, not alone took the people who had managed to escape the mild flu season, but also took people who wouldn't have died maybe for 3 or 6 months, mm-hmm. and maybe longer. And that created the spike. And that they died of all kinds of things, multiple organ failure, heart disease, respiratory conditions. They may or may not have COVID. You see, this is interesting. If you actually asked a lot of these people who are doing this, well, what were you calling COVID? Well, they're actually saying not just those who had had a test, but those who had any 2 or more symptoms of, which is like coughing or a fever, for example, which could be anything, even though they haven't had a test, even though the tests are not necessarily reliable. They cannot, it seems, it has not been demonstrated that they can distinguish between one coronavirus and another, and so on. As all of this, it seems to be so inexact And indeed, this is exactly what Professor Rancourt says, that actually we all of us have all kinds of viruses in our systems all the time. But then that the idea that all of this was COVID-19 is a cartoon version of reality.
So I think it is very interesting to hear the holes that you're picking in the narrative, right? And it is an established narrative that is adopted by the mainstream, right?
Yes.
The politicians, the media, I would still say most of the public, even though people cooperate to varying degrees, right? And what would be healthy, probably in a free country, to use that term that Americans like, would be where, imagine I was sitting in a, not me, but anyone sitting in a radio studio, and I have John Waters here, and I have Simon Harris here, and you can put it to him that there's this discrepancy, this inconsistency, this hiding of that, and he says, no, John, you're actually wrong here, or actually it's revealed that indeed there is this discrepancy and there is this inconsistency, or whatever. And just to finish the point, I am unable, and not that I am setting out to do this, but I am unable to offer a response. And I just think isn't it a shame that there isn't this space, this shared safe space for John Waters and Simon Harris, for argument's sake, to come together. And do you think that space is gone in Ireland, like irretrievably, or what would it take? Like I wrote down earlier, I was going to ask you, when is the last time you were invited to a mainstream Irish radio show or TV show, or were interviewed in a sincere way by a newspaper? Because even if you're wrong, surely wouldn't it be healthy to invite you to the table to have the discussion with whoever? Do you know? So,
yes. I'll answer the question. I was asked 5 years ago, just after I decided to stop journalism, I was asked on a program, but it was, I mean, even though I made my decision, the invitation was to review a book which was written by somebody I know very well, and that's something I would never do, regardless of how great the book was. I would not review a book written by somebody whom I knew well. So I declined that, and I haven't been invited to anything since. Okay. But you're dead right. I mean, for what you've described there, that process, that's what I was part of for like 30 years in Irish media. And I mean, I had a path of my own worn into the national broadcasting station, RTE, television and radio, for many years. And that was just a fact of life. I mean, I was on programs every other day virtually when I was a columnist with the Irish Times. And that's all gone. And it's not, I'm not bemoaning that as a loss for me. It's a loss. I don't mean me just, or even me at all. I'm saying that process needs to continue, and it has stopped. And media have become an instrument of something else. And that's what I would like to say a little bit about. I mean, it has become essentially an instrument of propaganda. Well, now, what does that mean? It's not just lies. It's not just, convincing people. It's actually terrifying people into knowing that there's only one version of reality that is acceptable, and they better accept it. And they better regurgitate it. And that's done in all kinds of ways. It's also done at an unconscious level through the use of fear and what I would a quasi-hypnotic technique, which I've written about in a magazine, in a blog, a website called Lockdown Skeptics. I've written about this because it's essentially a form of neuro-linguistic programming. But I mean, for example, see, hypnosis works on emotions, and when you can have a very heightened emotion and also a highly imaginative state, you can actually convince people. That's why it's actually impossible. Mark Twain says something like, "It's easier to fool people than to convince them that they've been fooled." And that's for the reason that people have buy-in. Once they buy in, once they're fooled, they buy into whatever they're duped by. And it's very hard to convince, because then there's a kind of an appalling vista that they have to face, that they've been kind of stupid or something, which isn't necessarily true when you're dealing with hypnosis, because, those people who remember like seeing stage hypnotists working. Like there's a guy called Paul Golden. He used to go on the TV in Ireland here on the Late Late Show, and he would pick 3 or 4 lads out of the audience, and he would line them up, and he would talk to them and give them words, and then he would click his fingers, and one of them would start looking for leprechauns, and another would, they was doing all kinds of stuff, and behaving like a duck or something, or a chicken or something like that. And then he would snap his fingers, and the subject would just stop and look around. Everybody would be laughing, and he would have no idea what had happened to him. Now, it's hard to believe that this could be happening here, but it actually is. Something very close to it is happening. I have a friend, I hadn't seen him for many years, and in the meantime, he had become a psychotherapist and a hypnotist in the medical context. And he said, I've been using the idea of hypnosis in various articles in relation to what was happening in Ireland about the referendums of the last few years and the propaganda campaigns that are being run. And I was using it as a metaphor, and I expressly said this, it's like a metaphor of hypnosis, but it's something like that in a certain sense. And he said, this guy said to me, he said, I've been hearing what you've been saying. He said, and I thought he was about to tell me off, and he says, you're only wrong about one thing. It's not a metaphor. It's not a metaphor. This is what they're doing. And he explained it to me how they do it. Like there's different phases, like there's the initial phase is kind of a love bombing, where we're all in this together, we're all fighting to save lives, and they build that up. And then there's a sort of second phase, is a kind of a conflictual phase where they kind of do the love bombing a bit, but they also kind of make it a little bit salty, like you have the kind of idea like of the image of the old people hugging their grandchildren through a cellophane sheet, something like that. There's a sinister element of that, to use that word again. And then in the final is the iron fist, is the velvet glove is ripped off and you see the iron fist, which they can see in Melbourne now for the last few weeks in particular, where the images coming out of there, like of absolute fascistic police activity. And I think that's happening in London. It happened last weekend as well. So so there's a real process, and look, I noticed this immediately around here, and I think it's pretty much everywhere, that on the ground as you walk around the parks and so on, the walkways, there are these two figures like chalk men, matchstick men in white, with an arrow, double-sided arrow either side, pointing in each direction. And the men, when you think about it, that what they're like more than anything is the chalk mark that they draw around the corpse of a murder victim. So you're being reminded of death subconsciously all the time. And this is the way all this is doing.
You think that's intentional, John?
Oh yeah, for sure. This is the level I'm telling you that they're actually doing it.
They've got it down to a T, that much.
Oh yeah, I would say that this whole operation was scripted by psychologists, certainly, but also by sci-fi writers, it seems to me, that the understandings they have about the human, just think about the face mask, what that's doing. Thomas Sheridan did a very interesting thing, but there's so many aspects, but he did a very interesting thing about a mask that actually, if you put a mask on there, like say for a ball, you can still see your face move, but when you put it on there, there's no animation whatsoever. Mm-hmm. And it actually, that's kind of part of what they're trying to do, it seems to me, is to actually dehumanize the human person. There's a sign in a cafe, I think it comes from a movie, somebody was telling me, but it's the kind of thing that would have offended me. It's a sign in a cafe, one of the few cafes I go to that actually serve me without a mask, without question. But it's a sign, and it says, wash your hands, you filthy animal. And you could be annoyed about that, but I actually think it's dead right. It's kind of ironic, and it's exactly what they're saying. It's saying to us, we're no longer Fergus and John, two separate human beings with characters and personalities and histories, and we are two germ bags passing in the street who better keep out of each other's way lest
the Elvis dance, John, to get out of the way. Yeah,
you filthy animal, get out of my way. That's the thing. And jumping into the path of the oncoming bus in case, for fear of getting a head cold from me. This is what they've done. Really, this is the most sinister thing that's ever happened in our society. We've talked about the stats, and I think I've made a good case on that. Well, people can check it out themselves. There's loads of stuff on the internet, real stuff. And forget this stuff that they'll tell you on RTE that, don't trust the media, don't trust the alternative media. They're telling you lies, it's all fake news. No, this is where you get the real deal. You don't have to take it all on board. You just take bits and pieces. What I do is, Fergus, I look at everything. It's like constructing a massive jigsaw on my living room floor. Mm-hmm. I construct a section over here and then a section over here that's in no way connected. and then a section up here, and gradually the pieces converge.
Like the elephant, right? The blind man touches the trunk, and he think, you know, that whole
that
adage.
That's right. Well, it's that in as it were in inverse form, like, because gradually you do get to see a pattern. Yeah. And you get to, you know, you accumulate, like lots of times there were things that didn't make sense to me as I went along, that scared me, even, that I thought there's a few times I thought I'm totally wrong here because this guy is saying something that conflicts. Then I would have to go off and explain that. And I found out, for example, one guy was talking about coming across the lungs of people who had died from COVID. And he said they were the worst state he'd ever seen. And I thought, oh my God, I better rethink this, you know? And then I saw another doctor who was explaining that what was doing, it was the ventilators that were doing this. That the ventilators are deeply unsuitable for this condition, because there is, whatever it is, that if you have whatever this is, even if you have most forms of respiratory virus things, that the compartments in your lungs fill up with liquid. And if you apply a ventilator like that, you essentially burst your lungs.
Yes.
So a lot of people did die of the use of ventilators and being intubated in that way. And I think that's something that hasn't come out fully yet. But I think that was relatively minor. I think certainly Professor Rancourt says that he thinks also that it's a minor factor, that the major factor was the psychological stress that was imposed on already vulnerable people.
So I don't mean to say this, and I know I've been laughing at a lot of what you're saying, and I think you appreciate I'm not laughing at you. Like, it's such a bizarre set of circumstances that sometimes that's all you can do, right? Or otherwise, I don't know, you don't know what to do. But I asked this question, and I don't want to be, is the word glib maybe, but or patronizing or condescending. But the question is this: where is the room in which these sci-fi writers are gathered together to write this script, or the psychologists or the hypnotists? Do you know? Because to say, well, this is the result of, you know, you can trace all these things together, right? Well, and you can paint the picture. So or is this a metaphorical thing, or is it kind of, do you not mean it literally? Do you know what do you mean when you talk in those terms?
I mean it pretty literally. Literally, in this sense that you see, there's been a convergence of government in the world in the last 20 years that was never been seen before, where these bodies like the United Nations and the World Health Organization acquire extraordinary power transnationally over all kinds of governments and intruding on different. And then you have an additional factor, which I meant to mention earlier, which is the cult of the expert. And this is a very interesting thing, you know, that there's now a belief. I mean, one time, you see, everybody was entitled to give their opinion, and people could judge whether they knew what they were talking about or not. But now, unless you have the paperwork in your back pocket to prove that you're actually an expert, you're not entitled to speak. And the irony of that is that even as an expert, you're only entitled to speak in your own discipline.
Exactly.
So that means that actually you have a load of voices talking at one another who actually are not talking about the same things at all. And there is no longer the idea of the polymath, or the person who is simply the citizen who absolutely has taken the trouble to inform himself or herself. Mm-hmm. You know, people say to me, oh, you're not an expert. Well, I'll tell you what, I say, you know, this body, I've lived in it for 65 years. Nobody else has. So I'm an expert on this, all right? I can tell you a lot about this body, right? So I am an expert, just as you're an expert in your body and he's an expert in his body. Yes. So this idea, you see, it's a fragmentation of discussion, and that allows the experts to go in now. What we've seen this extraordinary phenomenon. It's very clear in Britain. You see it in America with Trump. You see it in Britain with Johnson. You see it in Dublin, in Ireland with Varadkar first and now Martin, where the experts are essentially the government. The medical experts are now dictating what should happen, and the government are simply rubber stamping it. And they're dictating things that are absolutely detrimental for the economy, which is for the life of the people and for the life and death issues affecting the people. And but they don't have any, the government are not saying, well, you know, there was a time in politics, Charlie Haughey, the rather infamous Prime Minister Taoiseach that we had here in the 1980s, used to always say that economists economists, he said, should be kept in a separate room from politicians and only have messages taken to and from them on pieces of paper. That they should never be allowed into the rooms where decisions were being made. I think that's a very good principle, and it's one we've lost in our democracies. So the result is that actually, you have people dictating from behind screens whom we never see. The people that are fronting up are not the power brokers at all. They're not the power mongers. They're not the decision makers. They're simply spokesmen who are articulating what they're being told to say. And this makes plausible then what I say, that there are script writers. I'm a bit fanciful in when I say sci-fi writers, but there certainly is an element of this when you actually consider some of the what appear to be almost the gaslighting elements of this, or the psyop elements of it, the effects of mask, the idea that people are being dehumanized by these masks, and yet they are no use. And the very same people who are the medical experts telling us now that they're essential. 3 months ago, people like Dr. Fauci and Hugh O'Neill here in Ireland were telling us masks were useless. Don't wear them. Suddenly overnight said, oh, the science has now told us, the science is now telling. So masks have been around for something like 120, 30, 40 years, right? In the form we now know them. So what they're leading us to believe now is that for 119 and 3/4 of that 120 years, science was fairly settled on the idea that masks were only useful for one thing, which was that if you were doing an operation, you put it on to avoid yourself, contaminating the wound, if we can put it delicately, right? That was the only purpose they had. Suddenly, sometime around June, July of this year, 3 months ago, the science suddenly woke up and thought, oh, no, we were wrong about it. No, they didn't say we were wrong. They just said, actually, no, they're right. No, they never said they were wrong. They just said, no, masks are essential. They're essential to save lives. That was a political decision. It has nothing to do with health. And people have got to see this.
I had a couple of strange feelings this morning. I was getting a cardiac screening because I had tested positive, and I had the virus. I would say, I wouldn't say, oh, I was a false positive or whatever. I was quarantined for about 10 days a few weeks ago, and as a sort of a follow-up thing, I need to be very careful I don't libel anyone, but I was told by the people who let me live my day-to-day existence that I had to go and do this cardiac screening, some cardiac test, and that so then I went this morning, and a woman put this ultrasound thing to my chest and was measuring my heart and examining me and seeing if my heart had been affected by the virus, which, just on a very simple level, it seems to be an incredible waste of money to be checking me out really rigorously like this and wondering, because I'm young, I will be fine. But anyway, that's beside the point. The thing that struck me this morning, John, was I was given a sheet of paper after a second woman, I think she was a nurse. She did some other evaluation of me where she kind of wired me up to something. And I was given a sheet of paper when I walked from that room, and I had to give it to a third woman who took some blood, okay? And on the sheet, from the second woman to the third woman, and I was the middleman, it said problems, shortness of breath. And then it had, the other problem was getting a heart scan for COVID something, right? And I saw shortness of breath, and I thought to myself, why am I short of breath? Am I stressed out about something? Is it because I'm interviewing John today and it's going live? And what if this doesn't go well or whatever? Or is it because last night I didn't really sleep and so I'm not breathing properly? And I had this, and it's actually coming back to me now. I'm feeling the butterflies. I'm saying, why have I shortness of breath? I'm 22. What the hell is wrong with me?
Yes.
And I asked the third woman, why does this say this? And she said, and another nurse was coming in and out, and they said something to the effect that it's for insurance purposes, so that the insurance company will cover whatever screening is being done without saying, well, hold on, this guy, did he really need this test if he didn't have shortness of breath? Do you know what I mean? So they put this on. Now, this is my understanding from today, and I'm not
made it up.
naming anyone. But John, like, not only are these the experts in their field, but you apply a certain moral, or you would hope that there's some sort of moral, forthright, upstanding principle that grounds everything that they do, okay? And that everything is done with some sort of, I suppose, moral character, right? And not only are we trusting their expertise, but then we are also trusting their character. And it's the whole system that we lay our faith in, or we place our faith in. And this morning, John, I was thinking to myself, what's going on here? Like, they are putting a false bit of information about me and about my healthy condition or otherwise for some strange purpose. And it's obviously a financial one, right? In this case.
Oh yeah.
So it would make you question things like this. How much of this is the right thing to do, and then how much of this is self-interested? And it seems that, and people talk, and I'm not saying this means that big pharma is evil. I'm not saying that, but it does definitely make me question the whole system and say, where are the morals here? Where are the precepts? Where are the, like you say, as a journalist, you had certain rules you had to follow. Where are the rules for these medical professionals? And then the other irony is, these people who are filling out these forms, they're probably not, they're not the owners of the practice. These women, in this case, they were women, are probably earning, I don't know, I would guess no more than 50 or 60 grand a year, right? They're doing a job that they're carrying out orders. So in a certain sense, you don't blame them, but they are carrying out the generation of questionable information for some reason, and it makes me wonder.
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, but what you've described, the kind of thing you've described, is all over this. I mean, I've heard about it in America, and there was a Scott Jenkins, I think, is a doctor over in America, in Minnesota, who got into big trouble because he pointed out about the charges that were accruing to hospitals for virtue of having a patient diagnosed with COVID, that person being taken to ICU. There's an additional amount, quite a major, I can't remember the exact figures, but you were talking about 100 and something, I forget, $13,000, something like that. A pretty enormous sum of money that if you got somebody into the ICU, that's what the hospital could claim. In Ireland, I mean, somebody was telling me the other day that a friend of theirs had received, who was perfectly healthy, received a call from her doctor, whom she'd never heard from before, other than to go and see him occasionally when she was ill. But he actually called her up and asked her how she was. And she says, well, I'm actually fine. And she was asking a friend, she says, oh, that's because they get 30 quid for making a call like that. So this is all over that. So, but there was the old deep throat principle, follow the money, from Watergate. It's usually a good one, but I don't think it's the full story here. There's other stuff here, which relates to the climate change stuff that I mentioned, but also I think some kind of major attempt at a kind of resetting or reorganization of the world. My own belief is, and this is where I stop being a conspiracy theorist, it's not going to work because these people are not competent enough to make it work. They don't understand how an economy, for example, works, that it's an organic thing that needs to generate its own life to allow that it can be regulated to some extent. But what overwhelms me is about human culture and human interaction. And the one thing this is doing is savaging, it's attacking human interaction. When you think about it, what they're doing to human relationships, human attitudes, as we're saying, to one another, one-to-one. The very idea of, the little things that we enjoy in life, the little pleasures, there's nothing I like more than wandering downtown and going to a second-hand shop, charity shop, and going through the bookshelves and finding a book there for 50 cents or a euro that's kind of pristine and it's a book I want to read, and then taking it across the road to a cafe and starting to read it. That's a great. I can't do that now because most of the charity shops won't let you in without a mask, and I refuse to wear masks. And the cafes are no better because even the ones that would serve you have taken all the seats and chairs out, the seats and tables out. So
who's the exception, John? Who lets you in? And can you give them a plug?
Oh,
will they
well,
get in trouble?
the problem with giving them a plug, Fergus, is they might be closed down in the morning if I give them a plug. You know what I mean? Like, I wouldn't like to chance it. I can certainly tell you one that didn't let me in, and that was Fallon and Byrne in the People's Park, a place I've been going to for many years. I went in there with my step-granddaughter one day, and they were very rudely asked me to leave because I wasn't wearing a mask, and tried to explain to them that I had an exemption, which I have, because I say I can't wear a mask. Because I have multiple, as it happens, I wasn't telling them this because it's none of their business, but I have actually multiple, I suffer from sinusitis, and I also have this facial thing that blocks one side of my nasal passages pretty much entirely because of the paralysis that I suffered. But I'm not going to tell them my medical history in front of the entire, I'm telling you now in front of the entire world potentially, but that's different. But I'm not going to tell somebody who's interrogating me on behalf of an authority that I don't regard as my friend. And so, but you know, you also think, you know, what you're saying about the fear you had there and the anxiety that you had. I mean, just think of what they've done to the very idea, the most nondescript thing you can possibly suffer, which is a head cold, a cough, sore throat, sniffles. Suddenly, you will be made to feel like a criminal the next time that happens. You will have to hide yourself away. You will not be able to discuss it with anybody because they might think that you're endangering their health, and they'll say, you shouldn't be even speaking to me. How dare you? You know, they have done this. This is unprecedented. Like, this is complete. This is why I say it's a sci-fi thing. It's a psyop. I mean, it's not a conventional thinking thing. Now, it is possible that all of this kind of stuff could happen organically around the central idea, possibly. But I don't think so. I think it's all thought through. And it actually has a very sinister motive, which is not friendly to the human person in the slightest. Far from wanting to save lives, it actually wants to destroy lives, it seems to me.
So for you to go about your daily life as you would wish, it's obviously been made harder, right? The number of coffee shops you can go to is diminished. You can't go into any bookshops.
You can't go to supermarkets. We have to order our food online and get it delivered. You know,
so you're feeding, John, you're feeding the beast. How dare you? You're doing the online thing, you know. You're cutting away jobs.
That's a very interesting point. You know, I agree. I agree with you. But this is the amazing thing about this, and I was saying this previously to somebody. You know, I have a thing about bookshops. Like, I try to support bookshops, and there was a particular book that I wanted to get there recently, and a friend of mine told me, "Oh, the bookshop down Dunleary has it." And in fact, you know, I said, well, then they probably want masks in there, do they? So I don't know. But she says, it's inside the drawer anyway. So you just need to pick it up, hold it up, and buy it. So I went down, I looked around. There was nothing but signs, wear a mask, mask up, you know, all this stuff. And I said, oh. And I looked in the window and I was looking, couldn't see the book anywhere. So I went away. And then I had to just order the book online from Amazon. Jeff Bezos has made about, I don't know, 500 skillion dollars since this whole thing started. Like, he was already the richest man in the world. He's now the richest man in the stratosphere. And like, I tried multiple times to buy books from other places. I mean, yes. I had this brilliant idea that, okay, if I have to buy books online, what I'll do is Amazon are the best kind of central agency for finding out where books can be got. But they usually, you know, there are other bookshop sellers that they use. Yes. And they generally so why not just go directly once they see that so I've tried that a couple of times and it's a disaster. Funnily enough, if you actually deal with the companies themselves, it's a disaster. But if you deal with Amazon, who then use this company to send you the book, it works. Don't ask me how that works. It doesn't make any sense. And so I've reluctantly found myself having to go back again and again to that Amazon to actually, in a couple of instances, I had to actually get my money back because the book got lost. They misaddressed the package or something like that. The other suppliers. Amazon are extraordinarily efficient. I hate to say these things.
No, they're very good at what they do. Like, they're
ruthless. They're a ruthless company, but they're very effective.
Yes.
And that's very ominous for the world, because you see, the problem is that once they get to be a monopoly of the book trade, they will decide what books can be published, what books can be written, what books can be read, what thoughts can be seen, what thoughts can be heard, all that. And if you think that would have seemed implausible 20 years ago, that would have been a conspiracy theory 20 years ago.
Yes.
But now we see that the big tech companies behave in precisely that way in relation to views they don't agree with.
Where I was going though, when I was talking about the coffee shops and the bookshops that you can't go into the supermarket as well, one solution that your friend and a man I've been enjoying a lot, Thomas Sheridan, he always talks about this new rebirth that's going on, and he says this is the best education you'll ever get.
Yeah.
Seeing how people respond to all this, and he says keep your cool, and he says use this charge and that charismatic output and all this beautiful language, and he talks about magic and all that, right?
Yes.
And one term that he has said a number of times, and I'm interested by it, is the parallel society.
Yes.
That's one response to this. And it doesn't mean you go off like, no disrespect to the man, but like Mancon McGann and live in a house made of straw. Do you know that the guy, the Irish language activist? Like that's one way, right? You can go off into the wild. But that's not necessarily what it means. You kind of do what you have to do, maybe. Like you pay your taxes, right? And you pay for, if you get on a bus, you pay your fee. But you have some sort of removal from what Sheridan calls the normies, and you're not as caught up in certain things as you might otherwise be. So do you mind just talking to me about what that might look like? And again, this term is not a literal division, right? I occupy the parallel society, but there's something to that, isn't there?
There is, yeah. And it's a really interesting question. I mean, Thomas also says that now we know who the people are that we have to avoid for the rest of our lives. If they're the people who are snitching everybody up, they're the people who are telling everybody, where's your mask, all that kind of stuff. And now you know. So it has given great clarity to us. Now, his thing about the parallel society is really a fascinating thing. And I've talked to him about this. We haven't known each other. We're not friends as such, although I really like the guy and I admire him enormously. I think he's a tremendous intellect, you know, because he's a guy who's self-educated. He's written several books, very, very interesting books, a very good writer, very amazing thinker. He can sit in the front of his car and talk for half an hour, like off the top of his head, about the most extraordinary things. It's quite amazing.
And he came from the Ballymun Flats, and he really resents the elitism of a lot of this, because he came from not those kind of places.
Yeah.
You know?
And he's a pagan, and has been a pagan since basically I think he was 11 years old, and it's fascinating the way he talks about this, you know, and you know, he says he's not against Christianity, and I can understand a sense in which that's true, but he also is against Christianity in another sense, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, actually. I'm a Christian, I suppose, and I don't take offense at anything he says. I'm very interested in what he's saying. And he's talking about Ireland being naturally a pagan country, you know, that this Middle Eastern, you know, Sandman religion doesn't really suit us, you know, and that's an interesting thought. But his parallel society is essentially, to me, is that, and I can see this, but I'm torn, and I've discussed this with him, that it's to kind of not get embroiled in politics or in protests or all that, but instead to concentrate on doing the work that you want to do, that will express your own self and your personality, and you know that you will then survive, and you will help those around you to survive these travails that we're facing. And you know, I'm extraordinarily seduced by that idea. And I was talking to him about, you know, his attitude to what myself and Gemma are doing, like, which is he's kind of ambivalent, I think, that he admires it in a way, but he also thinks it's folly. That's my sense. Now, that may be slightly misconstruing him, but something like that.
He also doesn't like the Catholic thing as well. That's a big part, right. I think. But go on.
That's right. Yeah. It's not he doesn't like it. He thinks that it's actually misplaced, and you know, I can hear that as well, because there is a question. I have talked to him about that. You know, in a certain sense, Irish Catholicism was never pure Catholicism. It was also a bit of paganism, you know, that the wiring that we inherited and that was used by Catholicism was essentially the pagan wiring. And that therefore some of the residue remains. And in a lot of the attitudes, you know, the sense that what other people would call superstition, you know, the sense of the holy places and all of that.
Rock.
Yes, that these places had a deep spiritual significance. That's the pagan, it's the pagan inheritance, you know, and is somewhat disapproved of by Catholicism, pure Catholicism. But so it's very interesting, that stuff. But I was saying to him about that, you know, that regards Gemma O'Doherty, because she it was who kind of persuaded me to run for election last February, and she it was who kind of prevailed upon me, even though I wasn't feeling all that great in the election, or to come involved in this thing. And I kind of said to Thomas, that I kind of both curse her and bless her for that, because on the one hand she takes me away from that parallel society. She distracts me into some kind of public obligation, which Thomas would say is a kind of a Christian mind virus. And on the other hand, I bless her because I thank her for doing that, because I know that it is the right thing for me to do. And that whatever will happen with the rest of my life, there is a job to be done at this moment. And this is the way I've always kind of lived my life, in a way that I felt called to certain things. And I don't necessarily mean that in some kind of cosmic kind of sense.
Yeah, but still, yeah.
The circumstances of your life speak to you in a certain way at certain moments, and they leave you in absolutely no doubt as to what you need to be doing. And that happened to me. For example, I'll give you an example of that. I mean, I probably the most potentially prospective part of my life was in the early 90s, when I'd written several plays for radio and stage. I'll come back to one of the plays, which is quite interesting now at this moment. I want to talk about it. But I've written another couple of books in very short succession, and I was really I wanted to stop being a journalist. Even then, I didn't want to continue. And then I had a daughter, in 1996, and she was in England, so I had to go over there every week. And suddenly I found that the idea of going off and being a real writer, as I kind of fantasized about, wasn't really a runner. I had to stick with what I was doing. Okay. And that's what I mean, that life called you to certain things, to the circumstances that you end up being part of, Now, the play I want to talk about, it's very interesting, very briefly. And the reason I'm not telling it, this is a long time ago, and it only struck me recently when I picked it up. I started looking at the cover. It was published as a book form, in book form. It's called Long Black Coat. And it was actually about a discussion. The main dialogue was between a father and son, an old man and a young man. And there was another male, a little boy, who was absent. And the argument was about why the boy was absent. Now, the context was really a kind of a nuclear war situation. When I was a kid, there was a book in every household in Ireland, a civil defense booklet, and it was titled "What to Do in the Event of Nuclear War." And what you had to do in the event of nuclear war was you got your wardrobes, you filled them with earth from the garden, you put them in your windows, then you got all your books. It presumed you had lots of books, which is interesting. It didn't anticipate the Kindle. And you put them all on the kitchen table, and they're all around. And then you and your family get under the table with all your provisions for as long as you need to be there, So you have to shelter in place. And now the interesting thing was that this was set in the future. This was put on in 1994 in Kilkenny in the Arts Festival there, and then moved to Dublin. And did very well and got some really good reviews and all that. And it was published and won the Stuart Parker Award for the best new play of that year, which is quite amazing. But here's the thing. It was set in the future, but it didn't specify what date. But the date in my mind was 2020 when I was writing the play. And I wanted to hold this, but not to make it explicit, but leave it approximate, And the way I did that was that the character, the young man, who's called Jody, wore a T-shirt which had on it a picture of Pádraig Pearse, the great hero of the Irish Revolution, the Easter Rising of 1916. And the slogan was, Pádraig Pearse, 1916, 2016. But here's the point. It was a faded T-shirt. So it was old. So that was to suggest that the year was somewhere on from 2016, 2020. And when I looked at this picture and I saw this references like to sheltering and all this, and the idea of there was in the middle of the floor, there was a stand, like a hat stand, so we say, electronic thing, which has like the head of a dinosaur type figure. And you could put this head on and you press a button and you were there in Beirut or wherever It was actually described as a virtual reality helmet.
Yes.
In the script. Which I don't know that they existed at the time, but somebody may have. Again, as I thought, sci-fi writers were talking about stuff like this. And so that to me is astonishing. And I was talking to Thomas about this, and he talks about this as some kind of like message that catapults backwards.
Yeah, he had another example in his own stuff.
That's right, he did. Yeah, he had the phrase, was it new normal in his book by Psychopaths.
He had it italicized as well.
Yeah, really amazing.
Yeah.
In 2011, I think he had that book was published. Yeah. I forget what that book is called now. I've ordered it actually. It's about psychopaths. Thomas Sheridan. And it's apparently it's really.
The labyrinth of the psychopath. I actually just ordered it the other day as well. That's gas.
Yeah, he's an amazing character. That's a quite astonishing thing. So there's something there.
You were saying though that he says that is the what phenomenon taking place where you kind of foresee something, or that it goes back, or what's going on there?
Yeah, there's a philosopher and of all things the economist, Jacques Attali, brilliant guy, French guy, and he's written loads and loads of books, but one of them was Noise, the something about rock, it's about pop music. It's a really very interesting book, and he talks about the way that music prefigures the future, that it's kind of prophecy, that you can hear the future first in music.
Okay.
And I was thinking of an example of that, the classic example. I mean, of course, in a certain sense, all pop music is like that. Or first, the original pop music was like that because it announced something that nobody had ever dreamt of before.
The avant-garde thing, yeah.
But not just avant-garde, but even the very sight of Elvis, that collision of musics, of R&B and blues on the one hand and country on the other, coming together in this single body, in this dance and this voice. But then there was the example I'm thinking of was David Bowie in Berlin in 1977 and that song Heroes, where he saw a couple standing under the Berlin Wall, embracing, kissing, and he wrote this, "We can be heroes just for one day." 12 years before the wall came down. That's an amazing thing, like that, so I think there's something in what Sheridan is talking about. I've heard about this in little pieces, bits and pieces before, but I've never seen anybody so clear about it that it is actually a form of magic. And I think that's right. I think our understanding of magic is actually quite wrong. I mean, as I think I used the word magic to describe that phrase, conspiracy theory. It is a magical phrase. As I say, you have to give the devil his due. That is a magical phrase because it really achieves something which seems to be impossible. That out of the mouth of the person themselves, or that the mouth of ordinary people, you can feed into the mouths of people, unwitting people, the people who will become the victims of your agenda. You can feed into the mouths, the words that will destroy their chances of obtaining some freedom, some entitlement, something that they would like to have. That's an amazing achievement, although it's not a very nice one.
No. John, if you don't mind, I'm going to give you some fairly hard-hitting questions from one fella on YouTube, but I'm sure you'll be able to handle them. Is that okay? Because I asked...
Let's see.
From AIM, Alternative Irish Media. You may have come across them before.
No.
I'll just handpick a few questions here because there's a big long paragraph. Does John Waters believe the Irish nation will be able to sustain its claim to national status, in brackets, self-determination, if it continues policies that continue to belittle and slow kill the Irish language? Can the Irish nation be a nation if it gives up the self upon which its extraordinary claim of self-determination are based? How can we take a presidential candidacy seriously if the candidate has never bothered in his long literary life to learn as many as 100 phrases in the national language? Who's that referring to specifically? Is that referring to you? Anyway, let me just... I'm
not sure who that... I mean, I'm sure it applies to quite a few, I'm sure.
Why does Waters equivocate Irish identity as Marxists do by subjugating Irish hegemonic recreation, the Irish state, in anti-bilingual terms? Is this because he never bothered as a writer to engage the native literature of Ireland? Will he reform his sloppy understanding of the need to imagine and implement an Irish bilingual hegemony. So I don't know if you've ever been taken to task in that way, but do you have anything to say about all that?
Well, it's for one thing, it's completely misplaced, because in fact, even though I didn't have any upbringing in the Irish language other than the rudimentary learning we did in school, when I was 39 years old in 1995, I went back to school to relearn Irish. That was in the months before my daughter was born. And in that period, I learned, went to intensive courses in Irish and learned enough to become pretty fluent at that point, fluent enough to be able to educate my daughter in the first national language, which was my main ambition. And she was then, and she became and remains fluent in Irish. Mine has somewhat rusted again, but I'm very proud of that. And I don't think there's any, I don't know what he's talking about, frankly, and I don't think he knows what he's talking about. He knows nothing about me, it seems to me, or anything I've written, except what he's heard on Twitter. And that's not a very good way to know about anybody. I suggest he reads a few of my books or something like that.
Fair enough. Well, I hope he's watching. But yeah, John, I think...
as regards to the broader questions that he raises, to be fair to him, I mean, they're legitimate questions. I have dealt with them many times. I don't understand where he's coming from, because I've actually dealt with these in a very detailed way in different books, An Intelligent Person's Guide to Modern Ireland, for example, way back in 1997. What I have, the position I've taken was that there was a very strange thing that happened in Irish culture, which was an antagonism that developed psychologically, psychically against the language and against Irish culture. And that's an inherent symptom of the colonial condition, which is a condition which we haven't really acknowledged in our culture. Now, this is a kind of a controversial and dangerous point to be making now, because now we hear nothing but talk about colonialism in the global context of, Europe and America, and the whole idea of Black Lives Matter and all that kind of grievance politics, if you like. So there's a disincentivizing of discussion. Again, there is a disincentivizing. There has been historically a disincentivizing of discussion of this in the context of Irish history, for reasons which are actually to do with the condition of colonialism itself. Now there is a further disincentivizing on account of the idea that we shouldn't appear to be victims. We shouldn't present ourselves as victims, which is a valid enough point of view, but it's actually also dangerous, because if it prevents us remembering correctly, it is problematic. And my position has always been in that context that the whole point of this is not grievance, it's not revenge, it's not seeking reparation. It's actually memory, so that we can truthfully speak about our history. And he's quite right about the context of the language. The language has suffered enormously because of the penal laws and the history of that onwards, and the effect of that on people, the link that was insinuated between poverty and the Irish language, which became highly effective for Irish people. And that seems to me to be, and again, I've written about this, so I don't know what he's been reading or what he's going on, that this has actually almost imbued in the Irish consciousness a repugnance of its own language. I think he's mixing me up with somebody else, actually, and I know who as well. But again, this is typical. This is typical of what you get. I've written like hundreds upon hundreds of columns and dozens on this subject. Yeah. But he obviously hasn't read any of them. This is the problem with the internet. It sets people off, it winds them up and lets them out without ever having to require them to find anything out first. But the problem with the linguistic thing is that there is now in the Irish consciousness, the collective consciousness, an inbuilt resistance against the language, the Irish language, which is, whether we like it or not, causing the language to die before our eyes, including in the Gaeltacht, and the deterioration of the quality of the language, I think is generally agreed, is now so poor that it needs to be looked at as a matter of extreme urgency. And I, for one, I'm totally in favor of it being looked at. And I am, for one, totally in favour of the total, if it were possible, resuscitation of the Irish language and placing the Irish language at the foremost of our culture, at the head of our culture. And I'm totally in agreement about that. I agree with Pearse that without the Irish language, there is no Ireland. That's where we're going, and that's the symptom. That's one of probably the central reason why we are succumbing to the globalist tyranny and threat, is that our language died, and we don't have the means to express our particularity. I firmly believe that, and have always said that. I don't know what he's talking about, frankly, and I don't know who he's talking about. I freely admit that my language, my Irish, is not as good as it was. I don't get as many opportunities to speak it as I would like, but my love for the Irish language has not diminished, and everything I have done to make sure that my daughter, who is my sole successor and heir, continues to speak the language when I am gone, and that her children in turn will speak the language. I have done that. Maybe there are more things I could do. I don't know what the person is. Does he think that I'm running for president? I've never run for president. He's mistaken there as well.
Well, yeah, maybe it was a mistake, or I don't know. But anyway, I remember you writing about that very thing where you relearned Irish, or you went back when your daughter was born, and you wanted to have that and give us back the bad road. So fair enough. One thing you've written about at length is the existential struggle of the individual person, and how, in your case, you had certain voids in your life that you were filling with one thing, and then you had another, let's say, aid to help you through the struggle of life, right? And you've written at length about all of that, and books like Lapse Diagnostics and on all these kind of books. And what was the one you wrote in response to Nuno Phelan? What was that called?
Beyond Consolation.
Beyond Consolation, exactly. All this stuff, and this is, I think it's fair to say, this can be taken on by an individual and engaged with by an individual, as opposed to what now, where now you're talking about societal things and global politics and big agendas and all the rest, right? And what I'm asking you now is, how can the individual person, man, woman, or child, in anywhere in Ireland, anywhere in America, anywhere in the world, what solace can they find? What consolation can they find? What would you say to them to help them endure and continue at this time that is like no other?
Okay, remind me of that question in a few minutes, but I want to answer a different question first, when you haven't, which you kind of one we've touched on and glanced off for the last while in the conversation. And that's really something interesting, which relates to that point I was making about in the mid-90s, wanting to be, a real writer. And that was a kind of an obsession of mine at the time, because many of my friends were becoming novelists and playwrights, and I wanted to write plays above anything else. And I did write a couple, and I did some radio plays for the BBC. But my work as a journalist kind of conflicted with that, in the sense that it pissed people off, and that I annoyed a lot of people who might have been in the position to kind of put on my work and so on. They got scared of me and that. So that became a problem. But the weird thing about it is that idea that, that we are called to certain things by the facts. That is an unerring pattern I can see in my life. And I thought it was kind of reducing me to kind of some kind of random figure as a writer, until very recently. And now, lo and behold, I look back on what I've written, and there's an extraordinary kind of coherence to it in terms of where we are in the world now, that I didn't expect to be there. I didn't expect to find. My books are kind of obsessively about Ireland. Most of them are, almost all of them are about Ireland, or about Ireland in some sense. And they're about that whole, the struggle of Irish history and culture, and the struggle to survive, and the paradox then of the post-colonial condition, that you are both one thing and the other. You are both Irish and in our case English. That you have the culture of Cuchulainn and Pearse, and then you have Enid Blyton and Shakespeare as well. and you have Mungo Jerry and the Beatles and Morrissey and Georgie Best and John Peel and all those figures, and so I've been grappling with all these things, and now I find myself, almost, I suppose, in the twilight of my, in the autumn of my career, shall we say, if career I have, and probably writing my last handful of books in the next few years, if I survive. And the next book I'm going to write is going to be about this COVID business, for sure, in some way. That's what I want to do. And some of it I've written because I've been writing for various publications abroad and trying out certain ideas. So I know kind of some of the territory already. And then I have a book, that two books you mentioned, Lapsed Agnostic and Beyond Consolation. There's a third book in that, as it were, which now would amount to a trilogy, which I've had numerous attempts to finish in the last 6 years, and they have come to nothing, or 8 years almost now since I started this book. It's kind of the culmination of all that. And it's to answer the question, is it reasonable not to believe in God? Is it reasonable to believe there is nothing? Is nothing a reasonable proposition? And that's kind of a theme that I started in Beyond Consolation, but I want to kind of test it out and I have written most of the book, all of the book, in fact, but I need to revise it. And I have to be honest and say that in this course of this scamdemic or pandemic or whatever you would call it, I have been absolutely dismayed by the behavior of the Christian churches, and particularly the Catholic Church here in Ireland, which has behaved abominably towards human beings, that it has abandoned them in their hour of greatest need. And I find that absolutely sickening and hard to take, but that's another story. So that would kind of make it now a very bad time to finish that book, because I would have to root out the center of it and throw it away. Because, a lot of my thinking is following a Catholic path. And it's interesting that I run into Thomas Sheridan's ideas in that time, but I have to let all this settle around me. Mm-hmm. So that book is coming, or hopefully I'll be around to finish that, but in due course, in whatever form.
Yeah.
But so when I look back to 20 years ago, when I started writing about men and family law and the treatment of fathers in courts and male suicide and feminism and what I now call gender and all that stuff, I thought I was just kind of just following something that was attacking me. But it seems that everything that has happened has attacked me in some way, and I have actually had to retaliate and write out of it. And so I find that in a certain bizarre way, I have been over the target for many years without knowing there was even a target. And here I am now, and COVID is like the culmination in a certain sense, or certainly an accelerant of what has been happening in this short period, in this intense burst we've come through. And so I have an idea for writing a book about that, which I hope to have published next year. So to come to your question, which was what? It was, what do human beings hope for? No.
How can an individual persevere at this time? What solace could you maybe give them, or if there's any? Like, I know it's a very general question, but what would you say to people who, for one reason or another, have had the blues for 6 months, or whatever?
Well, all I can say to people is, what Pope John Paul II said repeatedly: "Be not afraid." This is our life. This is our life. This is the life we have. It is the only life we have, and for that reason, we ought not miss it through fear or rage or any of those things that distracts us. Let us pay attention to what is happening. Let us follow our paths, each of us, regardless of the circumstance, because that is, each day is the day that we have. That sounds a bit, wanky maybe, but
no, you don't need to. Yeah,
but,
I think.
I have a great friend of many years who is quite elderly now, Desmond Fennell, the great Irish philosopher, who's written many, many books about things, and he has been marginalized completely, even more than I have, and I take great pride in that. I'm almost now as marginalized as he was. That's a real badge of honor, I can tell you. But the last time I met him was a couple of years ago, maybe it's more. We met out in Dalkey during the book festival, Oh, it's more than 2. It's maybe 5, 6 years. And he was getting a bit stiff and all that. And we were sitting outside in the sun in June and talking. And I said to him, you know, Desmond, how does it feel like to be coming to the end of your days in these circumstances where the country is falling apart and all the things you fought for, all the battles seem to be lost, and we seem to be heading for the cliff edge? And he just laughed. He says, I'm an historian. Historians love to be around at the end of an epoch. So that's what we live for.
Wow.
And I think that's a really good idea. You know, I know
that's very dark, isn't it?
It's dark in a way, but it's also true in the sense that, you know, we have to deal with whatever we have to deal with. And if we are facing a tyranny, we have to deal with it. We have to fight it. And so we have to change our thinking if necessary. I remember actually one time I was in a certain situation where I was talking about, people will be able to guess maybe what this is about, but I shouldn't say what precisely I'm talking about. I was talking about a particular difficulty I was having in public, in a relatively public situation. And the situation I was facing was quite life-changing and a big responsibility and a big challenge and quite terrifying in lots of ways, in a personal way. And this guy came up to me afterwards, whom I kind of know. He was an artist and he's a smart guy. And he said, let's go for a coffee. And he sat down and he says, you appear to be very frightened by what you described. And I said, yes, I am, I think. And he said, well, what you need to do, he says, is to nominate a day of acceptance in the near future. So you nominate a single day in which you go alone someplace that you could feel safe and peaceful. And all that day you stay with the idea that your life is changing in this way, that your life is being changed, and that it may not be the same again, but it will still be your life. It'll be a different life, but still your life. And that you can do this. And I think that in a funny kind of way, that this is what is our answer to the new normal that has been posited against us as this tyranny, this coercion that has been imposed upon us, that we can actually make our own future by becoming determined that we will accept whatever is around us, and then we will focus our energies, as Thomas Sheridan says, in the energies, in the creative energies we have, and in caring for our loved ones and making sure that those that depend on us are safe. I think that is, you know, I've learned from that situation I'm describing earlier with that guy. Now we're quite a few years on from that. And I look back, even though it was a very challenging situation, it was the greatest thing in my life, overcoming that and being able to cope with it. That was my life. There was no other life I was going to have. And my work found its way in around it. And I was okay. I survived. You know, it was frightening at times, but I survived. And I'm going through stuff now with this, what we're doing with this court case and all that. That it could be terrifying, but I applied the same methodology. And I suppose another way of saying is that I have a belief in a greater thing, and that, you know, that thing will be there, and that, you know, it requires of me to trust and believe. So I do. And so there's lots of things that I can recommend to people just as ways of you know, sustaining yourself through this kind of stuff. I think that, you know, don't allow yourself to be terrified. You know, it is a choice in a way. We can choose. And the strange thing about terror is that it is the anticipation of terrible things is almost always. I haven't experienced all the most terrible things that many people have in Auschwitz or whatever we were talking about. But in a general way in life, my experience has been that when you're actually in the situation that you dreaded, there's something different about it, that there are possibilities. There are, you know, other thoughts that come to you, and that it's never the same as the fear of it. The fear of it has nothing to do with it, because you're then forced to actually confront reality, the situation as it is. And I have to keep relearning that lesson. You know, because sometimes I do surrender, not so much to fear. I was having this conversation the other day with somebody who was treating me from my Ramsay Hunt syndrome. And we were talking about it, and she said, you know, about talking about people being afraid. And I said, the funny thing about this, I'm not afraid about it. The emotion I have is not fear, it's grief. I'm grief-stricken at what is happening to my country. I'm grief-stricken at the quality of the people who have been chosen to lead my country and who are leading it into disaster. I'm grief-stricken at the corruption I see in every institution in Irish life. I'm grief-stricken at the you know, docility of my own people. I'm grief-stricken at the way that many young people seem to be so indoctrinated with cultural Marxist ideas that they don't know what's right and what's wrong anymore. But I'm not fearful for the future, because I know that when we are pressed to act, however docile we may appear to be, we will awaken like the lion, and we will become fearsome together, for sure. So these people who think that, you know, talk about I've said this repeatedly to people around me who are talking about the new normal and who believe it, and they're not conspiracy theorists. They just do, because I mean, if the World Economic Forum is actually talking in explicit terms, has been for several years, about the Great Reset and so on, you know. But I say they may have that idea, but they won't make it work, because they don't understand human nature and they don't understand how the world works. What they're trying to do cannot be done, and they certainly cannot do it. So, you know, they will fail. But the question is, what will we do to take advantage of that? Mm-hmm. And first thing we have to do is wake up, and we have to stop being afraid, and we have to start fighting back. And we have to snatch our country back from the jaws of these imbeciles.
John, as Bill O'Hurley used to say, we'll leave it there. So I think, if you don't mind, I don't think you could conclude a speech or a discussion any better than that. So,
thank you very much, Fergus. Lovely to talk to you.
John. Thank you for talking to me. I'm going to stop this live thing, and no, it's always a pleasure. So thank you.
Good night.
Slán.